If you found your way here tonight, there is a good chance some part of you is tired of holding on to something you cannot quite name. You only know your hand has been closed for a long time. Tonight, we are going to spend these hours with one quality, quietly, from many sides. The old teachers called it non-attachment, not coldness, not indifference. Something closer to a hand that has finally remembered it is allowed to open, finger by finger, without apology. If it feels right, let us know where you are resting tonight, and what time it is where you are. There is something steadying in knowing another hand, somewhere else, is loosening too. We will move slowly through old stories, across mountains, rivers, and quiet rooms, each one circling back to the same simple question. What are you still carrying that you were allowed to set down a long time ago? Some of it you will recognize immediately. Some of it you have forgotten you were even holding. We will not rush toward an answer. You do not need to understand non-attachment to receive it tonight. You do not need to have practiced anything. You only need to be here, breathing, willing to loosen one finger at a time. I want to tell you something honestly before we begin. I chose this teaching because I noticed, a few years ago, a small callus on the inside of my palm, exactly where my hand curls into a fist without my permission. I still do not fully understand why the body remembers how to let go before the mind agrees to it. So let your shoulders drop a little further than feels necessary. Let your jaw soften. Let the hand resting near you stay open, palm up, as though it were already finished holding anything. There is nowhere to arrive tonight. There is only this slow unclenching, breath by breath, story by story. We begin where most of us live without noticing it. In a mind that has been making a fist for so long, it has forgotten it is a hand. Most of us have known a mind like this. A mind that finishes the workday and keeps working anyway, somewhere underneath, long after the laptop is closed and the lights are off. You tell yourself the task is done. Your hand says otherwise. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with how much you did today, and everything to do with how little you have set down. You can feel it in your jaw, clenched in traffic over something that finished hours ago. You can feel it in your shoulders, carrying a meeting that ended at noon into a dinner at 8 in the evening. You can feel it most clearly in your hand, somewhere around the base of your fingers, where a fist forms without your permission and stays there long after there is nothing left to hold. This is the shape we are going to spend tonight with. Not a teaching about giving things up. A teaching about a hand that has forgotten how to open. You do not need to be in a high-pressure job for this to be true of you. A parent awake at midnight, still rehearsing a disagreement with a teenager, knows this fist. A student lying in bed, replaying an answer they gave in an exam that ended hours ago, knows it too. The fist does not care what kind of day you had. It only cares whether you have given yourself permission, yet, to let the day be finished. In an older world, this same tightness might have come from carrying water up a hill, or guarding a fire through a long night. At least the fire eventually burned down. At least the water eventually reached the top of the hill, and the carrying had an ending built into it. Today the tightness comes from a phone that never quite stops glowing. A notification that arrives at the exact moment you had finally stopped thinking about work. A feed that hands you someone else's grief and someone else's anger in the same breath you used to scroll past both. There is always one more message worth checking, one more reason the hand has not opened yet. The body was not built to release nothing, all day, every day. And so it does not. It simply keeps its fist. The old teachers had a word for the opposite of this. They called it non-attachment. It is easy to hear that word and think it means caring less. It means almost the opposite. It means caring enough to actually finish caring, instead of carrying the same worry in a closed hand for hours after it has stopped being useful to anyone, including you. Here is the misunderstanding worth clearing up early, because it will follow us through every story tonight. Non-attachment can sound like distance. It can sound like a kind of coldness, a person who has trained themselves not to feel things too deeply, who holds the world at arm's length so that nothing can touch them. This can sound like indifference, but it means something almost entirely different. It means you are allowed to feel something completely, all the way through, without your hand turning into a fist about it afterward. Think about the difference between these two things for a moment. There is the version of caring that shows up fully when something is happening, and then lets go once it is over. And there is the version that shows up fully when something is happening, and then keeps showing up, uninvited, at 2 a.m, in the shower, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. The first is presence. The second is what we are calling the fist. You know this fist. You have felt it close around an email you already answered, a conversation that already ended, a decision that has already been made and cannot be unmade. You replay it. You rehearse what you should have said. You carry the meeting into the evening into the night into a sleep that does not quite arrive the way you wanted it to. None of this makes the original moment any different. It only adds a second weight on top of the first one, a weight made entirely of your own mind, refusing to put something down. This is not a flaw in you. This is what minds do when they have spent years rewarded for holding on. You were likely taught, somewhere along the way, that letting a thought go meant you did not care enough, that staying tense meant you were taking something seriously. So your hand learned to close. It learned this so well that by now it closes without asking you first. Notice, too, that the fist is rarely about the actual size of what happened. A small comment from a stranger can occupy more of your night than an entire difficult day did. This is because the fist is not measuring the event. It is measuring something else, something closer to whether you feel finished with it, whether you have been allowed, by yourself, to set it down. Most of the time, you have not asked yourself that question at all. You simply keep holding, because holding has become the default, and opening your hand has not yet become a practice. This is not a sign that something is wrong with you. This is what minds do when they have not yet been shown another way. Many of us carry this fist into the one place it does the most damage, which is the hour right before sleep. You lie down, the body finally still, and the mind chooses exactly this moment to open every file at once. The argument from earlier in the week, the message you have not sent. None of it is being solved by being replayed in the dark. It is simply being held, again, by a hand that does not yet know it is allowed to rest. So, before we go any further, here is the whole shape of tonight in one sentence. We are not here to convince you to care less. We are here to practice noticing the exact moment your hand closes, and to discover, slowly, story by story, that it is always allowed to open again. Let us explore a story about this. There is a man who manages a small team at a shipping company on the edge of a large city. His job is not especially dangerous or dramatic. Mostly it is schedules, and trucks that are late, and drivers calling in sick, and a manager above him who measures the whole department in numbers on a screen. He is good at his job. He has been doing it for many years now, long enough that the road home no longer requires his full attention. This particular tightness in his hands had not always been there, or at least not this badly. It had crept in gradually, sometime during a difficult stretch months earlier, when 2 of his drivers had quit within the same week, and he had found himself covering routes himself before dawn, then sitting through performance reviews in the afternoon, then driving home with both kinds of exhaustion stacked on top of each other. He had gotten through that stretch the way people usually do, one day at a time, and by the time spring arrived, everything on paper had returned to normal. The schedules were full again. The reviews were finished. But something in his hands had not gotten the message that the stretch was over. They had learned, during those difficult months, to stay braced for the next problem before it had even arrived, and nobody had ever told them it was safe to stop. Every evening, he drives along a route that follows a river for part of the way. He knows this road well enough that his hands could probably manage it without him. And most evenings, that is exactly what happens. His hands drive. The rest of him is somewhere else entirely, replaying a meeting from that afternoon where a driver, the same one as last month, missed a delivery window by 2 hours, and where his manager said, in front of several other people, that the team needed to be more reliable. He had gone over this exchange many times since it happened. He had composed, in his mind, several versions of what he should have said back, careful and unbothered versions, sharper versions he would never actually say out loud. None of them existed anywhere except inside his own skull, and yet they were taking up more space in him than the actual meeting had. His hands, he noticed one evening, were gripping the steering wheel far tighter than the road required. The river beside him was calm. The traffic was light. There was no reason for his knuckles to be pale, no reason for his jaw to be tight enough to ache. He looked down at his own hand on the wheel and, for a moment, simply watched it. It looked like a hand that was still in the meeting from that afternoon, still arguing with a manager who was, by now, almost certainly at home eating dinner and thinking about something else entirely. He tried something he had not tried before. He said, out loud, to no one, to the empty car, "The meeting is over." It felt strange to say. It also felt, faintly, true. He flexed his fingers on the wheel, one at a time, the way you might test whether something is actually as stuck as it seems. His hand opened slightly. The ache in his jaw did not vanish, but it loosened, the way a knot loosens when you stop pulling on both ends of it at once. He did not arrive home enlightened. He arrived home tired, the ordinary tiredness of a long day. Nothing more dramatic than that. His daughter ran to the door the way she always did, holding up a drawing of something that was either a horse or a dog. It was hard to tell which, and for a moment the meeting did not exist at all. It returned later, while he was washing the dinner dishes, the way these things do. Uninvited, and faintly resentful at having been forgotten even briefly. But for the rest of that evening, when the meeting tried to come back, as it did several times, he noticed his hand on the steering wheel of his mind, so to speak, and asked it, gently, to open. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it took longer. He was surprised to discover that simply noticing the fist, without forcing it open by sheer will, was often enough to begin loosening it on its own. A few days later, at a family dinner he had been quietly dreading because his mother-in-law had strong opinions about nearly everything, he caught himself gripping his fork the exact same way he had gripped the wheel, knuckles pale, jaw tight, replaying a comment she had made about his job not 20 minutes earlier. He noticed it almost immediately this time, the way you notice a familiar smell before you can name it. Under the table, where no one could see, he opened his free hand flat against his thigh, fingers spread, and said nothing out loud. He did not need to. The noticing itself seemed to be the larger part of the practice. The conversation moved on around him. His mother-in-law shifted to a different subject entirely, and somewhere in the middle of passing the bread to his daughter, he realized the comment had already lost most of its weight, simply because his hand was no longer the one carrying it. He did not decide to stop caring about his job, or about doing it well. That was never the offer. What changed was much smaller and much stranger. He began to notice the difference between the meeting itself, which had ended in the middle of the afternoon, and his hand's decision to keep holding it, which had no ending time at all, unless he gave it one. The river outside his window had kept moving the entire time. He sat there, gripping the wheel. It did not pause to relive its own afternoon. It simply continued, the way water does, carrying what it carries and releasing it at the same time, without ever seeming to choose between the two. He found himself thinking about this again the next morning, washing his hands before breakfast, watching the water run over his fingers and disappear down the drain without resistance. Water never seems to ask permission to let go of anything. It simply moves on to whatever is next, the same way it always has, long before anyone gave it a teaching about how to do that. His daughter came into the kitchen still half asleep, climbed onto the chair beside him, and asked, the way children sometimes ask the largest questions in the smallest voices, why he had been talking to himself in the car yesterday. He had not realized she had heard him through the open window when they pulled into the driveway. He thought about it for a moment, drying his hands on the towel by the sink, and told her, honestly, that sometimes his hand forgot a meeting was already over, and saying it out loud reminded it. She considered this with the total seriousness that only a child can bring to something so small, nodded once, and asked if her hand could forget things too. He said it probably could, someday, and that, when it did, she would already know what to do about it. Driving to work that same morning, along the same road beside the same river, he noticed his hands resting more loosely on the wheel than usual. 10 and 2, the way a manual once said they should, rather than the white-knuckled grip that had become so ordinary to him that he had stopped noticing it as a grip at all. The river was higher than it had been the day before, swollen slightly from rain overnight, and it moved past the same bend in the road, carrying twigs and leaves and small debris without any apparent effort, releasing all of it somewhere further downstream where he would never see it land. He did not know yet whether the meeting from 2 days ago would try to return again that afternoon. He suspected it might. But he found, for the first time in a long while, that he was not dreading the drive home in advance, the way he usually did. He would simply notice the hand again, if it needed noticing, and ask it, the way he had learned to, whether it was still holding something that had already finished happening. You probably know this exact feeling, even if your version of it has nothing to do with trucks or rivers. Maybe it is a message you sent that has not been answered yet, one you check for more often than you would like to admit. Maybe it is an old argument with someone you love, technically resolved, still replaying somewhere in the back rooms of your mind at certain hours of the night. Maybe it is simply your phone, resting face down on the table beside you right now, still managing to occupy a small, clenched corner of your attention, even though nothing on it requires anything from you in this exact moment. This is the particular weight of living inside a world that never fully closes. Work used to end when you left the building. Now nearly everything stays half open, available to be checked, reopened, replayed, at almost any hour. Your hand was not designed for a world with no closing time, so it has learned to hold everything a little, all the time, just in case. You are allowed to put some of it down tonight. Not because it does not matter, because it has already happened, and your continuing to grip it does not change what happened. The way the man's pale knuckles did not change anything that was said in that meeting. The work of caring was already finished by the time the meeting ended. What continued afterward was something else. Something that felt like responsibility, but functioned more like a habit of the hand. This is, very often, the real reason sleep does not come easily for so many of us. It is rarely the day itself keeping you awake. It is the hand that has not yet been told it can stop holding the day. Non-attachment is not about pretending the day did not happen, or pretending it did not matter to you. It is about letting yourself feel it completely, once, with your whole attention, and then allowing that to be enough. You do not have to feel it 9 more times tonight for it to count as having been felt. Think of the small, ordinary moments this shows up in, almost too small to notice on their own. The way you check a message a second time after already reading it, as though reading it again might change what it says. The way you can be lying here right now, warm, safe, with nowhere to be until morning, and still feel some small, unfinished thread pulling at you from somewhere in the day that has already ended. None of this means you are doing something wrong. It only means the hand has not yet been given permission to open. You may notice, even as you hear this, that your hand is not quite ready to open all the way. That is completely fine. Non-attachment tonight does not require a finished result. It only asks for a slight loosening, a fraction of an inch, the kind of release that tends to happen almost on its own, once something has finally been seen clearly, instead of merely held in the dark. If you notice, right now, some part of your body holding something the way his hand held that wheel, you do not need to force it open. You can simply notice it the way he did. Sometimes noticing is the whole practice. The fist loosens slightly just from being seen. The way a hand resting inside someone else's hand sometimes opens on its own, without either person deciding to make it happen. If you find yourself drifting as we continue tonight, that is exactly right. You do not need to stay awake to receive any of this. The hand can keep loosening even while the rest of you sleeps. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice whatever your hands are doing right now, wherever they are resting. Notice if there is any small tightness left over from today, anything still being held a little too carefully. You do not need to release it all at once. You only need to notice it is there. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is an old story, much older than shipping companies and steering wheels, about two travelers on a muddy road, and a weight that one of them carried for many hours after the other had already set it down. It is one of the oldest stories of its kind, and it has survived this long for a reason. It begins, as these things often do, with rain. It begins, as we said, with rain. Two travelers were making their way along a country road that had turned almost entirely to mud. The kind of rain that does not announce itself as a storm but simply continues, hour after hour, until the ground itself seems to give up holding any shape at all. This is where we find our second kind of heaviness tonight, the kind that has nothing to do with how much something weighs, and everything to do with how long we agree to keep holding it after it no longer needs holding at all. Most of us have done something like what you are about to hear, though usually without rain, and usually without a road. There is the weight of a task itself, which has a beginning and an end, a shape you can feel start and feel finish. And there is a second weight, entirely separate from the first, made up of nothing but your own continued attention to something that has already concluded. The task, and the memory of the task. Most people, most of the time, confuse one for the other completely. Tonight's teaching comes from an old Zen story, the kind told for generations in monasteries across Japan, about two monks who shared a single afternoon and walked away from it carrying two entirely different things. One of them set his burden down at the edge of a road and never picked it back up. The other carried it for the rest of that day, then through the evening, then, as far as anyone can tell from how the story is usually told, for considerably longer than that. We are not telling you this story to suggest that one monk was good and the other was bad. That would miss the point of it almost entirely, and it would turn a teaching about the mind into a small morality lesson about manners. What actually happened on that road was something far more interesting than right and wrong. It was a demonstration, almost by accident, of how two people can live through the exact same few minutes and end up, hours later, carrying completely different amounts of weight from it. Tenzan was not somehow a better monk than Aikido. He had simply, at some point in his training, or perhaps simply in his temperament, learned the specific skill of letting an action be finished once it was finished. Aikido had not yet learned this. Almost none of us have, fully, which is part of why this small story has survived for as long as it has. Let us slow down and look closely at what actually happened in those few minutes, because the story is often told quickly, almost as a joke, and something important gets lost in the speed of it. A monk reaches out and helps a stranger across a difficult stretch of ground. He does this the way you might hold open a door, or steady someone who has slipped, the way you would do almost anything for a person in front of you who needs something you happen to be able to give. There is no deliberation in it. He does not weigh the decision for very long. He sees the need, and he meets it. And then, this is the part most of us skip past too quickly, he moves on. This can sound, on first hearing, like the easy half of the story, the version with no real cost to it. but it means something far more demanding than it appears to mean. Moving on requires a kind of trust that most of us were never taught. A trust that an action, once completed, is actually complete and does not need to be relitigated, defended, or replayed for the rest of the day in order to count as having happened correctly. His companion, walking beside him the whole time, watched the same few minutes unfold and experienced something entirely different. Not because anything more happened to him. Nothing happened to him at all. He simply began thinking about what he had seen. And once he began, he found he could not stop. You know this kind of watching. You have done it yourself, probably more than once this week. Watching someone else's choice and feeling something tighten in you that has nothing whatsoever to do with your own actual circumstances. Here is what makes this story endure after so many centuries of being told. It is not really a story about monks, or rules, or roads. It is a story about the astonishing difference between an event and your relationship to that event after it has ended. The event lasted perhaps a minute. The relationship to it, in the case of the second monk, lasted considerably longer, and as far as we can tell, it was entirely self-generated. Nobody made him keep carrying it. He simply did not know, yet, that he was allowed to set it down. You have likely noticed, by now, that this is the same shape we spent the last hour with. The meeting that ends at a certain time on a clock somewhere, and the version of the meeting that continues in your body long after the clock has moved on without it. We keep returning to this shape tonight, not because there is only one lesson to learn, but because this particular pattern, once you see it clearly in one place, tends to reveal itself almost everywhere else in your life as well. Let us explore a story about this. Two monks named, in the old telling, Tanzan and Aikido were traveling together between monasteries, the way young monks often did in old Japan, walking for days at a time from one teacher to the next in search of deeper instruction. It was the season of heavy rain. The road beneath them had turned into a long stretch of soft, clinging mud, the kind that pulls at the bottom of a sandal with every step and turns what should be a short walk into a slow, deliberate one. Their robes were soaked through at the hem. Neither of them had spoken much that morning, saving their breath for the climb ahead of them and the rain that showed no sign of easing. Tanzan was the older of the two by perhaps a decade, broad through the shoulders, the kind of monk who walked at the same steady pace, whether the road was dry and easy or, as it was that day, thick with mud up past the ankle. Aikido was younger, more careful in his habits, the sort of student who had memorized every rule of the order before he had fully learned to sit still in meditation, and who took a quiet pride in following each of those rules exactly. They had walked together for 2 days already on this particular journey, mostly in comfortable silence, occasionally trading a few words about the route ahead or the weather. The easy companionship of two people who know each other well enough not to need conversation to fill every mile. They came around a bend in the road and found a young woman standing at the edge of a particularly difficult stretch of mud. Dressed in a fine silk robe, she clearly did not want ruined. Looking down at the ground in front of her with the specific helplessness of someone who has no good option left, she glanced up at the two monks, then back down at the mud, then up again, as though hoping one of them might have a solution she had not thought of herself. Tanzan, the older of the two, did not pause to consider the situation for very long. He stepped forward, lifted her into his arms without any particular ceremony, the way you might lift a child or a sack of rice, and carried her across the worst of the mud, his own sandals sinking deep with each step, the cold water seeping through the cloth wrapped around his feet. She was lighter than he expected, and she held herself very still in his arms, the way people often do when they are being helped by a stranger and are not quite sure of the etiquette of the situation. He felt none of the hesitation Aikido would later accuse him of feeling, only the simple physical task of placing one foot carefully after the other until the ground beneath them grew firm again. He reached solid ground on the other side and set her down gently, his arms already moving on to whatever the road required of them next. She thanked him, straightening her robe and checking the hem for damage, and within a few steps had already turned her attention to whatever waited for her further down the road. The encounter folded neatly into the ordinary business of her day, already nearly forgotten. He gave a small nod, already turning back toward the road ahead, and the two monks continued on their way as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Aikido said nothing for the rest of that afternoon. Inside his own head, however, he was far from quiet. He replayed the scene from a dozen different angles. The lifting, the woman's face, Tanzan's easy nod afterward, searching each time for some detail that would make sense of what he had just watched a respected senior monk do without the slightest visible hesitation. He composed, somewhere in the back of his mind, the conversation he intended to have about it once they reached shelter, revising the wording several times, sharpening it, softening it, sharpening it again. He said nothing as the rain finally eased into a fine mist somewhere past midday, and he said nothing through the long climb toward the temple where they would spend the night. His jaw set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead of him with an intensity that had nothing to do with the difficulty of the path. It was only once they had arrived, once they had eaten a simple meal in near silence, once the hour had grown late enough that the quiet between them had become its own kind of statement, that he finally spoke. "We are not supposed to touch women," he said, his voice low but tight. "It is one of the oldest rules we follow as monks. You know this as well as I do. How could you simply lift her into your arms like that, in the middle of the open road, as though the rule meant nothing at all?" Tanzan looked at him for a long moment, as though trying to recall exactly what Aikido was referring to. "I set her down on the other side of the mud hours ago," he finally said. "Why are you still carrying her now?" Aikido did not have an answer for this. He sat with it for a long moment, turning it over, searching for a counter-argument and finding none. He had not been thinking about the woman at all. Not really. He had been thinking about the rule, and about what it meant that Tanzan had broken it, and about what kind of monk does such a thing. And underneath all of that, if he was honest with himself in the quiet of that room, about whether Tanzan's ease in that moment said something uncomfortable about his own difficulty in moments like it. The woman herself, the actual person standing in the mud, needing help, had disappeared from his thinking almost immediately. What remained, hour after hour, was a story he had built about her, populated entirely by his own judgment, carried the entire length of the road without her ever knowing she was still being carried at all. Some weeks later, the story is sometimes told, Aikido found himself walking alone past a different stretch of muddy road, and noticed a merchant arguing loudly with a young apprentice over a damaged cart wheel. The The kind of small dispute that happens a dozen times a day in any market town and is usually forgotten by sundown. He felt the familiar pull to stop, to weigh in, to carry an opinion about who was right away with him for the rest of his walk. He paused at the edge of the road, recognizing the shape of the pull before it had fully taken hold of him, and asked himself, almost as an experiment, whether this particular argument actually belonged to him at all. It did not. He continued on his way, the merchant's raised voice fading behind him within a dozen steps, and noticed, with some surprise, how rarely he had tested this before, and how much lighter the rest of his walk felt for having tried. He thought of Tanzan that evening, setting down his bowl after the meal, and found that he no longer needed an apology for what had happened on that earlier road, nor did he feel the old urge to bring it up again to prove some point about discipline. The argument he had once carried for an entire night had simply finished, the way the woman's crossing had finished for Tanzan within a matter of seconds. It had only taken him considerably longer to learn the same small lesson his companion seemed to have known all along, without ever needing it explained to him in words. You may not have carried a woman across a muddy road today, but you have very likely done something closer to what Aikido did than you would like to admit. Someone said something in a meeting, or a message arrived with a tone you did not like, or a stranger online expressed an opinion you found careless, and some part of you picked it up and has been carrying it since, turning it over, building a case, rehearsing your response. Long after the person who said it has moved on entirely to thinking about something else. This can sound like caring about justice, or standards, or what is right. Sometimes it is exactly that. But notice how often the thing you are carrying has stopped being about the actual person or the actual moment, and has become, instead, a story you are telling yourself about them, populated by your own judgment, carried the entire length of your evening without the other person ever knowing they are still being carried. The road, in the old story, did not care which monk crossed it more gracefully. It simply continued onward, the same after both of them had passed as it was before. The woman on the other side went on with whatever her day held next, almost certainly without giving either monk another thought. The only place the encounter continued to exist, hours later, was inside one particular mind that had decided, without quite deciding to keep it alive. You might ask yourself, gently, what you are carrying tonight that the other person involved has probably already set down. Not to make yourself wrong for carrying it, only to notice that the weight you feel right now may not be coming from the event at all. It may be coming entirely from your own continued grip on it, the same grip we have been speaking about all evening, simply wearing a different costume this time, dressed up as principle, or memory, or being right. In the age we live in now, this particular weight has multiplied in ways the old story could never have anticipated. A single afternoon can hand you dozens of small moments like the one on that road, an opinion scrolling past on a screen, a comment beneath something you posted, a tone in someone else's message that you cannot quite read correctly. Each one offers your mind the same old invitation Aikido accepted without realizing it. You do not have to accept it tonight. You are allowed to let some of what you saw today simply finish happening, the way the road finished being crossed, without following any of it for the rest of the night. There is a particular kind of relief available the moment you notice you have a choice in this at all. Most of us go years assuming that noticing something automatically obligates us to keep thinking about it, That attention, once given, has to be paid out in full before it can be withdrawn. Aikido discovered, on that second road weeks later, that this was never actually true. Noticing and carrying are two separate acts. You can notice a thing completely, see it clearly, even feel a brief flash of opinion about it, and still set it down within a dozen steps, the way he did, simply by recognizing that picking it up was a choice rather than an obligation. If you find this difficult to feel fully right now, that is completely normal. Some of what we carry has been carried for a long time, and it does not loosen in a single evening, or from a single story about two monks on a muddy road. It only needs to loosen a little. A fraction of an inch is still movement. You do not need to resolve any of this before you fall asleep. Whatever you are still carrying can simply rest beside you tonight, unfinished, while you finish instead. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice anything you might be carrying right now that belongs to someone else's afternoon rather than your own. A comment, a glance, a tone you read into something that was never actually said. You do not need to decide anything about it. Simply notice that you are holding it. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is another kind of weight we have not yet named tonight, one stranger than the rest, because it is made of things that are not even there anymore, things that finished happening so long ago that only your hand remembers holding them at all. We will turn toward that next, slowly, the way we have been turning toward everything else this evening. There is a particular kind of weight that has nothing left holding it up except memory. The job you left years ago. The person who said something unkind to you in a hallway when you were 11 years old. The version of yourself who made a decision you still cannot quite forgive, even though the person who made that decision was younger, more frightened, and knew considerably less than you know now. None of these things exist anywhere in the actual world anymore. The job is gone. The hallway has likely been renovated more than once, by people who never knew you walked through it. The 11-year-old grew up and became you, carrying forward only the feeling and almost none of the actual detail. And yet, somehow, your hand is still closed around all of it, as though letting go would mean the thing never happened at all, rather than simply meaning it is over. We are calling this a ghost burden tonight, because that phrase is closer to what it actually is than the word memory alone allows for. A memory, on its own, is simply information, a fact about something that occurred. A ghost burden is a memory that has been given a body it does not actually have anymore, a weight you continue to feel in your shoulders and your stomach and the back of your throat for an event that, in any measurable sense, finished a very long time ago. This is different from the weight we spoke of a little while ago, the meeting that ended this afternoon, the judgment about someone else's choice on a muddy road. Those weights, at least, belong to events recent enough to still have some faint claim on your attention. Ghost burdens are older than that. They are the ones that have outlived their own context so completely that you sometimes forget, until something jogs the memory, that you are even carrying them at all. They simply live in the body, quietly, the way old furniture lives in a room you have stopped really looking at. Everyone carries a slightly different collection of these. For one person, it might be a childhood nickname that still stings decades later. For another, It might be a single sentence said by a parent, long since passed, that somehow outlived everything else either of them ever said to each other. The contents differ from person to person. The shape of the carrying tends to look remarkably similar. Most of us assume that a memory simply sits there, inert, like a photograph in a drawer, available to look at when we choose and otherwise harmless. This can sound reasonable, but it means something quite different from how memory actually behaves in most of us. Most of the time, a ghost burden does not wait quietly in its drawer. It surfaces uninvited, usually at the worst possible hour, dressed up as something urgent, something that still requires your attention right now, even though the actual event it refers to required your attention exactly once, a long time ago, and has not required anything from you since. It rarely knocks politely. It tends to arrive already mid-sentence, as though the conversation had simply been paused rather than ended decades earlier. You know this if you have ever lain awake, remembering, in vivid, unwanted detail, something embarrassing you did at a gathering years ago, your whole body responding as though it were happening again in this exact moment. Your face actually warming with old embarrassment for an audience that has long since forgotten you were even there. The body, in this moment, cannot fully tell the difference between remembering an old wound and reopening it. It responds to both in almost exactly the same way. This is one of the strange cruelties of how minds work, and also, looked at from a slightly different angle, one of the more hopeful things about them. If your body responds to an old memory as though it were happening now, then it is not actually the old event causing your distress in this moment. It is the act of remembering itself, happening fresh, right now, in your nervous system, regardless of how long ago the original moment occurred. This means the distress you feel tonight about something from years past is not evidence that the wound never healed. It is evidence that you are thinking about it right now, which is a slightly different thing, and a thing you have more say over than it might feel like in the moment. The wound itself may be entirely closed. What you are touching tonight is closer to a scar your own attention keeps pressing on, out of habit more than necessity. Notice, too, how selectively the mind chooses which ghosts to keep close at hand. You likely cannot remember most of what happened to you on most ordinary days of your life. Entire years dissolve into a handful of fragments, and yet a single sharp moment of shame, or grief, or fear from decades ago can remain as vivid as something from yesterday, preserved with a clarity that nothing else from that period of your life receives. The mind is not preserving these moments because they are important in any objective sense. It is preserving them because, at some point, it decided they were unfinished, and unfinished business, to a mind, behaves like a held breath, refusing to let go until something resolves it, even if that something never actually arrives. This is non-attachment's particular gift when it comes to the oldest weights we carry. Earlier tonight, we spoke of letting go of something that ended an hour ago, or a day ago. Ghost burdens ask something slightly different of you, not because the practice itself changes, but because the distance involved is so much larger that the absurdity of still holding on becomes almost impossible to miss. Once you actually look at it directly, nobody is asking you to pretend the original wound did not matter. The invitation is only to notice that the wound finished happening a long time ago, and that what you are feeling tonight is not the wound itself, but your own mind's habit of visiting it again. There is a kind of quiet relief available in realizing that you do not have to keep this particular appointment every single time it is offered to you. Let us explore a story about this. There is a woman, now well into her 50s, who still remembers, with uncomfortable clarity, an argument she had with a close friend when she was 23 years old. They had shared an apartment for 2 years, the kind of friendship that forms quickly in your 20s and feels, at the time, like it will simply continue forever without needing any particular maintenance. They had cooked meals together in a kitchen too small for 2 people to stand in comfortably, traded clothes, stayed up late more nights than either of them could now count, talking about everything and nothing in the specific, easy way you talk when you have not yet learned that some friendships do not last. The argument itself was about something almost embarrassingly small now. Looking back, a borrowed dress that came back with a stain on it, a comment made in frustration that landed harder than either of them intended. They stopped speaking shortly after. Life did what life does. One of them moved away for work. Messages became less frequent, then stopped. Then, in the unremarkable way most friendships actually end, simply were not resumed. She has built, since then, an entire life that has nothing structurally to do with that friendship at all. She married someone else, raised children who are now adults themselves, built a career, grew older in all the ordinary ways a person grows older. And yet, several times a year, usually late at night, usually for no reason she can identify, she finds herself back in that apartment, replaying the exact words she said, hearing her own voice say them again, feeling the same hot flush of shame she felt at 23, as though no time at all had passed between then and now. She mentioned this once, almost as a joke, to her own daughter, while they were folding laundry together on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. Her daughter stopped, a towel half folded in her hands, surprised to learn her mother was still carrying something from before she herself had even been born. "Why does it still bother you?" her daughter asked, not unkindly, just curious. The question of someone young enough to assume that old pain simply expires on its own after enough time has passed. The woman did not have a ready answer. She had never actually asked herself the question directly before, in those words, with that much honesty. She had simply assumed the feeling was permanent, a fixed cost of having said an unkind thing once, decades ago, to someone she had genuinely loved. The way you might assume a scar will always ache slightly in cold weather without ever questioning why. That night, lying in bed with the window cracked slightly to let in the cool air, she tried something different. Instead of reaching for the memory the way she usually did, replaying it, defending herself inside her own head, arguing both sides of an argument that had ended 30 years earlier, she simply let the memory arrive and named it, quietly, to herself. There it is again, she thought. The old argument. It is not happening right now. It happened a long time ago. To 2 people who no longer exist in quite the same form, in an apartment that has probably been renovated several times since, with a landlord who has probably changed twice over and may not even remember either of their names. She felt the familiar flush of shame begin, warm across her chest, the way it always did, and instead of following it down into the usual spiral of rehearsed defenses, she simply watched it rise, peak, and, after a few minutes, begin to recede on its own, the way a wave does once it is finished arriving, without her doing anything in particular to make it leave. It did not disappear forever. She knew, even as she fell asleep that night, that it would likely visit again at some point, the way old ghosts tend to. But something had shifted slightly in how she held it. It felt, for the first time in a long while, less like something happening to her, and more like something passing through a room she happened to be standing in. In the weeks afterward, she found the practice oddly easy to repeat, almost easier than she expected something this old to be. Whenever the apartment, or the dress, or her own younger voice tried to resurface, she would simply greet it the same way. There it is again, and let it move through her the way weather moves through a valley, present for a while, then gone, leaving the ground more or less as it found it. Months later, at a class reunion she had almost talked herself out of attending. Someone mentioned the old friend's name in passing, not knowing the history between them, simply catching up on who had ended up where. The woman felt the old flush rise immediately, faster than usual, sharper, the way a ghost sometimes returns with extra force after being ignored for a while, as though testing whether the new arrangement would hold. She excused herself, found a quiet corner near the drinks table, and did exactly what she had practiced in the dark of her own bedroom months earlier. There it is again, she thought, watching her own pulse slow back down. Older now, smaller, somehow, in the bright light of a crowded room, than it had ever felt at 2 a.m. She returned to the conversation a few minutes later, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she could say the old friend's name herself, out loud, without anything in her chest tightening at all. She drove home that night thinking less about the friendship itself, which still carried its own small, ordinary sadness, and more about how strange it was that she had spent 30 years assuming the wait was permanent, simply because no one had ever shown her it was optional. Somewhere on that drive, with the streetlights passing in their familiar rhythm, she found herself almost laughing at how much smaller the whole thing had become, simply by being looked at directly instead of carried sideways for 3 decades. She did not forget the friendship, and she did not decide it no longer mattered. What she stopped doing was confusing the old argument with something still in progress. The friendship had already ended, decades earlier. In the ordinary, quiet way most friendships end. What had continued, all this time, was not the friendship itself, but her own nightly habit of reopening it, checking on it, as though it might still need defending. The way you might keep returning to check on a door that has been locked for 30 years, just to make sure it is still locked. Once she saw the difference clearly, the ghost did not need to be exorcised or solved. It only needed to be recognized as a ghost, something that visits but does not actually live there anymore, no matter how convincingly it sometimes dressed itself up as something current and urgent. You very likely have a version of this same ghost, perhaps several of them, each one tied to a different decade of your life. An old argument, a choice you still privately judge yourself for, a version of yourself at some earlier age who did not yet know what you know now, and who you have not quite forgiven for that. These ghosts rarely announce themselves clearly. They tend to arrive disguised as a sudden mood, a tightness in the chest with no obvious cause, a wave of shame that seems to come from nowhere until you trace it back and realize it is decades old. Some of them you could probably name immediately if asked. Others you may not even recognize as ghosts yet, simply as moods that visit you for reasons you have never quite traced to their source. Modern researchers, working from a completely different direction than any old teacher ever did, have described something quite similar. They have found that the mind often struggles to tell the difference between a thought about the past and the past actually happening again, and that simply naming a thought as a thought, rather than living inside it as though it were current fact, can loosen its grip almost immediately. This matches almost exactly what the woman in the story discovered without any researcher's help at all, simply by trying something quietly, alone, in her own bed, late at night. The old teachers called it something similar in their own language, simply seeing clearly, or not grasping. What all of these point toward, regardless of which century or which vocabulary you happen to prefer, is the same, small, almost embarrassingly simple shift. A ghost burden loses most of its weight the moment you recognize it as a ghost, something visiting from elsewhere, rather than something actually happening to you right now, in this room. Tonight, you might try this yourself, gently, before you fall asleep tonight. If an old memory arrives, as it sometimes does in the particular stillness of night, you do not need to push it away, and you do not need to follow it all the way down either. You can simply notice it the way the woman did. There it is again. It is not happening now. It happened once, to an earlier version of you, who did the best they could with what they knew at the time, with the resources they had available to them then, which were almost certainly fewer than the ones you have now. You are allowed to let it visit without inviting it to stay. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice if any old, familiar weight has surfaced while you listen tonight. Something from long ago that does not actually belong to this present moment at all. You do not need to resolve it, and you do not need to chase it back to its original source. You only need to notice that it is a visitor passing through, not a resident who lives here permanently. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is a forest on the other side of the world where an old teacher once sat through an entire night of rain with nowhere to hide from it, soaked through and shivering, and discovered something there that none of his years of careful study had managed to teach him. We will travel there next, slowly, the way we have been traveling all evening. The teacher we are about to meet spent much of his early life testing himself against fear in places most of us go out of our way to avoid. Cemeteries, empty forests, known locally for tigers and for stories of the dead returning. He did this deliberately, not because he enjoyed suffering, but because he had noticed something many of us never quite get around to noticing. That the things we are most afraid of tend to lose most of their power the moment we stop running from them and simply sit down in their company instead. Tonight's facet of non-attachment is the hardest one to practice and the simplest one to state. Some things cannot be gripped, no matter how tightly you try. Weather is one of them. Grief is another. The slow decline of a body, the loss of someone you love, the arrival of news you did not ask for. These belong to a category of experience that does not respond to your preferences at all, regardless of how forcefully you hold them. You can grip a fist around something that will eventually need releasing anyway, like a meeting that already ended, or a friendship that already faded. But you cannot grip the weather into changing its mind, no matter how tightly you close your hand around the wish for sunshine. Most of us, faced with this category of experience, do exactly what you would expect. We brace. We tense every part of ourselves that can be tensed, as though enough resistance might somehow change the forecast. This rarely changes anything about the weather itself. It does change a great deal about how exhausted you feel by the time the weather passes. There is an old teaching, found across many traditions in slightly different clothing, that the forest itself never bothers with this kind of resistance. Rain falls on it the same way it falls on a city street, and yet a forest, somehow, looks different afterward than a person usually does after the same storm. Tonight we will sit, briefly, inside one particular storm, with one particular teacher, and notice exactly what he did instead of bracing. Non-attachment, in this particular shape, is sometimes the hardest one to hear, because it can sound, at first, like an instruction to simply accept whatever happens to you without complaint, to stop caring whether things go well or badly. This can sound like passivity, but it means something considerably more active than that. Accepting the rain does not mean pretending you enjoy being wet. It means putting down the second, exhausting layer of suffering that comes from insisting, uselessly, that it should not be raining at all. Notice the difference between these two things. There is the actual discomfort of a difficult circumstance, the cold, the loss, the unwelcome news, whatever it happens to be in your life right now. And there is a second discomfort, layered on top of the first, made entirely of your own resistance to the fact that the circumstance is happening at all. The first kind of discomfort usually cannot be avoided. It is simply what it feels like to be a body moving through a difficult moment. The second kind, the resistance itself, is almost entirely optional, even though it rarely feels optional while you are inside it. Most of us were never taught to separate these two layers from each other. We grew up assuming they were a single, indivisible weight, when in fact, one of them has always been negotiable. You have likely noticed this difference yourself, in smaller ways, even if no one ever pointed it out to you directly. Waiting in slow traffic feels different depending on whether some part of you is still insisting the traffic should not exist at all. The traffic is identical in both cases. What changes is the second layer, the part of you fighting a fact that has already, simply by occurring, settled the argument in its own favor. This is what the old teachers meant when they spoke of surrendering to what already is. Not surrendering as in giving up, or stopping your efforts to improve things you can actually influence. Surrendering as in releasing your grip on the part of reality that has already happened, the part that is no longer a question, still being decided. The rain has already started falling. Arguing with that particular fact, no matter how passionately, has never once stopped a single drop from landing, and has never once made a single hour pass any faster than it was already going to pass. There is something almost athletic about this kind of release, though it looks, from the outside, like the opposite of effort. It takes a real act of will to stop bracing against something your body has been trained, your whole life, to brace against automatically. The forest does not need to practice this. It was never taught to resist in the first place. You, on the other hand, were almost certainly taught the opposite. That bracing is what responsible. caring people do in the face of difficulty. That to relax in the middle of a hard thing is somehow to stop caring about it. Tonight's teacher discovered something different. Somewhere in a particular night that began the way these nights tend to, without any warning at all. Let us explore a story about this. There was a young monk in northeastern Thailand who had spent years doing exactly what a serious student of the Dharma was supposed to do. He had studied the scriptures closely, sitting for long hours in a dim study hall with texts spread across a low wooden table, memorizing passages until the words ran together in his sleep. He had learned the precepts, the careful structure of monastic discipline, the Pali language in which the oldest teachings had first been written down. Each new chapter promising, somewhere ahead, the understanding he was looking for. He had done all of this with real diligence, and yet he found himself, in his mid-20s, no closer to understanding suffering than the day he started, despite having read more about suffering than almost anyone he knew. His father's death, when the monk was still in his first years of training, had cracked something open in him that study alone could not close back up. He had watched a strong, capable man become suddenly fragile, then gone, in the space of what felt like no time at all, and the books in his hands afterward had nothing useful to say about the particular silence that followed. The empty chair at meals, the unfinished work left in the fields. Disenchanted with the limits of scholarship, he left his settled life of study and became a wandering forest monk, the kind who owns almost nothing and sleeps wherever the day's walking happens to end, sustained only by whatever food villages offer along the way. For years he walked the countryside this way, sleeping in forests known for tigers, in caves where the air stayed cool even at midday, in places most people crossed the road to avoid after dark. He carried almost nothing. A robe, a bowl, a few small necessities, and walked long distances on bare feet that had grown accustomed to stone and root and the occasional thorn. He sought out exactly the conditions most of us spend our entire lives arranging our schedules to avoid. Not out of any taste for suffering, but because he had begun to suspect that the fear underneath ordinary life would never actually be examined if he kept managing his circumstances comfortably enough to avoid ever meeting it directly. One of these chosen places was a cremation ground, a clearing where the dead were brought to be burned, a place soaked in the particular stillness that surrounds death in any culture, the ash from old fires still faintly visible in the soil. He went there specifically to sit with his fear of dying, reasoning that a fear faced directly tends to lose most of its grip, while a fear managed from a careful distance simply waits, patiently, for the next unguarded moment to return in full force. He had not accounted for the storm. It arrived the way storms do in that part of the world during the rainy season. Suddenly and completely, no gradual build, simply rain falling as though the sky itself had decided to empty all at once. Thunder rolling through the trees on every side of the clearing, lightning briefly turning the rows of old cremation markers, a stark, pale white before the darkness swallowed them again. There was no shelter worth mentioning where he sat. Only the bare branches overhead doing almost nothing to slow the water. Within minutes, he was soaked through, the cold working its way into him in a way that had nothing symbolic about it at all. Simply a wet, shivering, entirely physical misery, made sharper by the darkness and the particular loneliness of a man with nowhere to go and nothing to do but remain exactly where he was. He could have left. Nothing was stopping him except his own earlier decision to sit there until morning. He stayed anyway, and somewhere in the middle of that long, wet, cold night, something in him stopped fighting the rain itself. He had been resisting it the way anyone resists discomfort, bracing his shoulders, gritting his teeth, wishing, uselessly, for it to stop, replaying in his mind all the reasons this particular storm was unfair, untimely, more than he should have had to bear on top of everything else that night already asked of him. At some point, worn down past the point where resistance had any energy left to draw on, he simply let the rain be rain. He felt cold. He felt alone. He let both of those things be exactly as large as they actually were, without adding the extra weight of insisting they should be different, or smaller, or over already. Nothing about the storm changed when he stopped fighting it. The rain did not lighten out of consideration for his surrender, and the thunder did not grow gentler because he had finally stopped arguing with it. What changed was considerably stranger than that. The misery, examined directly instead of resisted, turned out to have an edge to it, a place where it stopped being unbearable and simply became weather, passing through a body that happened to be sitting in a clearing that night, the way weather passes through anything left out in it long enough. He noticed, somewhere near dawn, that he had stopped counting the hours until the rain would end, and had simply been sitting in it instead. The way you might finally stop watching a clock once you accept that watching it has never once made the hands move faster. He did not leave the cremation ground transformed into someone who no longer felt cold or fear. He left, when morning eventually came, simply as a man who had discovered something about the difference between pain and the resistance to pain, a difference that no amount of reading the scriptures in a dry room had managed to show him as clearly as one wet night had. The fear of death that had brought him there in the first place had not vanished completely, but it had loosened its grip slightly, the way anything loosens once you have actually sat inside it, instead of only thinking about it from a safe distance. He carried this particular night with him for the rest of his long teaching life, returning to it often when his own students asked him how to bear what could not be changed. Decades later, by then, an old teacher himself with students of his own gathered from many countries, his body began to fail him in slow, undeniable ways, the kind of decline no amount of discipline can outrun forever. He did not resist this any differently than he had once resisted the rain. He let his students see exactly what an aging, a failing body looked like, without pretending otherwise for their comfort or his own. His hands, eventually too unsteady to hold his own bowl. His voice eventually gone entirely. The disciples who had once walked great distances to hear him speak, now simply sitting quietly beside his bed instead. Several of them later said it was the clearest teaching he ever gave them, delivered without a single word, simply by letting his own decline be exactly what it was. You are very unlikely to spend tonight in a cremation ground in a thunderstorm, but you are almost certainly, at this exact moment, bracing against something you cannot actually change, the way he braced before he stopped. Maybe it is news about your own health or someone else's. Maybe it is a loss that has already happened and cannot unhappen, no matter how much of your energy you spend wishing otherwise. Maybe it is something far smaller, a delayed flight, a broken plan, an evening that did not go the way you needed it to go. Maybe it is simply the particular ache of getting older, watching your own body do things it did not used to do, and finding some part of you still arguing with that fact every single morning in front of the mirror. In every one of these cases, there are two separate things happening, and only one of them is actually still under discussion. There is the circumstance itself, which has already settled into being exactly what it is. And there is your relationship to that circumstance, which remains, even now, surprisingly open to revision. The teacher in the storm could not change the rain. He could only change whether he met it with an additional layer of suffering or without one. This is not the same as telling you to feel nothing about hard things. He was cold. He felt the cold completely, with his whole body, the entire night, in his fingers and his feet and the back of his neck, where the rain ran in steady cold lines beneath his collar. Non-attachment, in this shape, never asks you to stop feeling. It only asks you to notice when feeling has turned into fighting, when you have stopped simply experiencing a difficulty and started, instead, demanding that the difficulty be something other than what it actually is. You might notice, lying here right now, some small version of this happening in your own body. A tightness somewhere that has been bracing against something for longer than you realized. The way his shoulders braced before the rain finally taught them otherwise. You do not need to solve whatever it is bracing against. You only need to notice the bracing itself and ask, gently, whether it is actually helping, or whether it has simply become a habit your body picked up somewhere along the way and never put back down. The forest he sat in that night did not become a different forest by morning. It was still wet. It was still cold. And yet something in how he held all of it had shifted considerably by the time the sun came up. Not because the night had gotten easier, but because he had finally stopped adding his own resistance on top of it. This is the same hand we have been speaking of all evening, simply gripping a different kind of object now. Earlier tonight it gripped a finished meeting, then an old argument, then a memory decades past its expiration. Tonight it grips the rain itself, or whatever the rain represents in your own life right now. Something already falling, already happening, that no amount of closed fist insistence has ever once managed to stop. The forest teaches the same lesson the steering wheel and the muddy road already taught. Simply wearing weather for a costume this time, instead of a meeting or an old friendship. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice anywhere in your body that might be bracing right now against something it cannot actually change tonight. A held shoulder, a tight jaw, a stomach that has been clenched for longer than you realized. You do not need to release it forcefully. Simply notice it the way the rain was noticed, fully, without adding anything extra on top of it. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is a king, in a story far from any forest, who spent years winning battles he was never entirely certain he wanted to fight, and who discovered, once the fighting was finally over, that the thing he had been protecting all along was never really the throne at all. We will travel there next. We have spent this evening, so far, learning to set down things that hurt, a meeting that exhausted us, a judgment that was never ours to carry, an old wound replayed long past its expiration, a storm we could not control. Each of these asked the same question in a slightly different costume. Can you put this down, even though it is uncomfortable to keep holding? Each time, the weight in question was, in some sense, unwanted, something we would have preferred not to be carrying in the first place. Tonight, we are going to ask something considerably stranger. Can you put something down even when it is going well? Even when you have won? Even when the thing in your hands is, by every external measure available to you, a success? This is the facet of non-attachment almost nobody warns you about, because almost nobody needs convincing to release something painful. Letting go of suffering sounds, on the surface, like an easy sell. Letting go of triumph, of identity, of a role you fought hard to earn and finally hold securely in your hands. This is a far harder request, and it is exactly the request our teacher tonight answered. At the precise moment in his life when answering it made the least obvious sense. Most teachings on letting go arrive while you are already suffering, while the thing in question has already started to hurt enough that release feels like relief rather than loss. This story works differently. It asks you to imagine doing the hardest version of this practice at the easiest possible moment, while everything was, by every visible measure, going exactly right. He was a king, not a king who inherited an easy, peaceful kingdom, but one who spent years defending his country against a vastly larger invading force, twice, and won both times, against odds most historians still find remarkable. By any measure available to the people around him, he had everything a person in his position could possibly want. Security, victory, a line of succession already arranged, a nation that, for the first time in years, was no longer at immediate risk of being overrun. And it was at exactly this moment, the moment most people spend their entire lives trying to reach, that he set the entire thing down and walked into the mountains to become a barefoot monk with almost nothing to his name. This can sound, on first hearing, like a story about renunciation, about turning away from the world in favor of something purer and more spiritual. It means something more interesting than that, and considerably more useful to you, lying here tonight, almost certainly not a king, and almost certainly not planning to abandon your responsibilities tomorrow morning. The teaching is not that success is worthless, or that achievement should be avoided, or that the things you have built in your life deserve to be abandoned. The teaching is about the difference between holding something and being held by it. A king can wear a crown the way a monk once carried a woman across a muddy road, fully, completely, with his whole attention, and then set it down when its purpose has been served. Or a king can become the crown, can fuse so completely with the role that there is no longer any clear boundary between the man and the position, no part of him left over that exists independently of what he has achieved. This second condition is the one most of us live inside without ever quite noticing it. We do not usually become kings, but we become our careers, our reputations, the specific story we tell about who we are and what we have accomplished, until the story and the person telling it become so tangled together that losing the story feels indistinguishable from losing ourselves entirely. This is why retirement destabilizes so many people who otherwise love their work, even when the retirement itself was carefully planned and genuinely wanted. This is why an empty house can feel less like freedom and more like erasure to a parent who spent decades being needed in a particular way. Every room suddenly quiet in a manner that has nothing to do with peace and everything to do with absence. The role was never supposed to become the entire person. It simply did. Slowly, the way anything becomes permanent when nobody ever questions it. Year after ordinary year, until the questioning itself starts to feel dangerous. Anicca, the old word for impermanence, is usually taught through loss, through grief, through the painful reminder that nothing lasts. Tonight's teacher offers a gentler entry point into the same truth. If even your victories are impermanent, if even the things going right in your life are, by nature, temporary arrangements rather than permanent fixtures, then impermanence is not only a warning about what you might lose, it is also a permission slip. You are allowed to release your grip on the good things too, not because they do not matter, but because gripping them tightly has never once been the thing that kept them yours. The throne was never going to remain his forever regardless of what he chose. The only real choice available to him was whether he would be the one to set it down deliberately, or whether time, illness, or circumstance would eventually do it for him, the way it eventually does for everyone. Crown or no crown, there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes specifically from defending a position of success, a fear underneath even the best circumstances that asks, quietly and constantly, what happens if this is taken from me? Who will I be then? The king in tonight's story seems to have asked himself this question directly, at the height of his power, rather than waiting for circumstances to ask it for him. What he discovered in answering it honestly was stranger and more freeing than either continuing to grip the throne or being forced to relinquish it against his will. Let us explore a story about this. He was born with, according to the records kept of his birth, an unusually golden cast to his skin, enough that people at court began calling him the Golden Buddha, almost from infancy, a nickname that followed him long before anyone could have known how literally it might one day apply. As a boy, he was drawn to Buddhist teaching with an intensity that worried his father, the reigning king, who needed an heir prepared to rule, not a contemplative withdrawn from the practical demands of the throne. He studied with a respected lay teacher at court whenever his schedule allowed it, absorbing teachings meant for serious monastic students far more readily than he absorbed the lessons in statecraft. His tutors actually wanted him learning. More than once as a young prince he attempted to slip away from the palace at night, on foot, in the dark, making for the distant mountain of Yentu, where hermits and forest monks were known to live simply among the bamboo and pine, sustained on almost nothing, answerable to no one's expectations but their own practice. Each time, the palace guards caught up with him on the road before he had gone very far, finding a prince in fine clothes, already dusty from walking, with no particularly good explanation ready for why he was heading toward having nothing when he had been born into having everything. He was returned, each time, to his studies, his ceremonial duties, the life that had already been arranged for him before he was old enough to object to it with anything more than his own two restless feet. He became king regardless, the third ruler of his dynasty, married, fathered an heir, and settled, as kings do, into the considerable daily weight of holding a nation together. The weight became considerably heavier when a vast invading army arrived from the north. Not once, but twice, within a few years, each time vastly outnumbering his own forces, each time threatening to end his dynasty and his country's independence entirely. He led the defense himself, strategizing through long nights by lamplight, watching men under his command die in numbers no peacetime king ever expects to count, sending letters to commanders in the field whose replies sometimes arrived too late to matter, retreating strategically, when retreat was the wiser choice. Even though retreat rarely feels like wisdom in the moment it is being chosen. Twice the invaders were driven back. Twice the kingdom survived. Against odds that historians still find difficult to fully explain. The much smaller force somehow outlasting an empire that had conquered nearly everything else it had turned its attention toward. By any reasonable measure, this was the moment to consolidate, to enjoy the considerable spoils of having survived what so easily could have ended his line entirely. He had, after years of war, exactly the security he had been fighting for. A grateful and intact kingdom. A son old enough to eventually inherit it. The kind of hard-won stability most rulers spend entire reigns chasing without ever fully catching. And it was at this precise moment, not in defeat but in complete, hard-won victory, that the old pull toward the mountain returned to him. The same pull that had sent him slipping out of the palace as a boy. Except, now, there was no father left to send guards after him. No throne. He was being asked to abandon his duty too. He ruled for several more years after the wars ended, securing the succession carefully, training his son in the particular burdens of the role, making certain the transition would be stable rather than abrupt. Only once he judged the kingdom genuinely settled did he do something almost no one in his position chooses to do. He gave the throne away. Not because he was forced to. Not because he had lost it in some palace struggle or been pressured by rivals. He simply walked away from it, of his own choosing, at the height of his own success, and went to the mountain he had been trying to reach since he was a boy, slipping out of the palace at night. He took a new name once he arrived, one that meant something like the Great Ascetic, and lived afterward in conditions about as far from a palace as it is possible to imagine. He climbed the same steep stone paths that pilgrims still climb today, thousands of weathered steps cut into the mountainside, through groves of bamboo that closed overhead like a green ceiling, past pine trees that had stood there for centuries before he ever arrived and would stand there for centuries afterward. He slept in simple wooden hermitages, ate whatever the mountain and visiting villagers provided, and taught whoever climbed up to find him, founding a school of practice that insisted spiritual life did not require leaving the world entirely, only releasing your grip on needing the world to be a particular way. He spent the rest of his life teaching this from the mountain, walking between hermitages and temples scattered across the slopes in the cool morning mist that settles over that range most days before the sun has fully cleared the ridgeline. His former crown now belonging entirely to someone else. His own days filled instead with bamboo groves, birdsong, the particular silence of a mountain temple at dawn, and students who came to him, having no idea, until they arrived and were told that their barefoot teacher had once commanded armies and worn a crown more elaborate than anything most of them would see in their lifetimes. He unified several older schools of practice that had existed separately before him into a single lineage suited to his own country and his own people, rather than simply importing a tradition wholesale from elsewhere and asking everyone to adapt themselves to it. The mountain itself seemed to suit him in a way the palace, for all its comforts, never fully had, less because the mountain was simpler, and more because nothing about it asked him to be anything other than exactly what he was in that moment. He never described his choice as a rejection of the life he had lived before it. The philosophy he eventually taught from the mountain held that genuine practice did not require fleeing the world at all, that a person could live fully within their responsibilities and still hold those responsibilities lightly. Present in the middle of ordinary life, the way you might be present in the middle of a temple. He had defended the kingdom because defending it was what that chapter of his life required of him. He left the throne because staying would have meant mistaking one chapter for the entire book, holding onto a role that had already done what it needed to do, simply because letting go of something successful felt, to almost everyone around him, like an inexplicable kind of madness. He died, years later, in a small hermitage further up the same mountain he had first tried to reach as a runaway boy. An old man by then, his body simply finishing the long arc. It had been moving along the entire time. The same arc every body moves along, regardless of whether it ever wore a crown. The infant once nicknamed for his golden glow died, by most accounts, with the same unhurried steadiness he had brought to setting down his throne decades earlier, neither grasping for more time nor pushing the moment away, simply letting one chapter end the way every chapter eventually does. On a quiet mountain, he had finally, after a lifetime of trying, been allowed to call entirely his own. You do not have a throne to give away tonight, but you almost certainly have something functioning the same way in your own life. A role you have held for so long that you can no longer easily picture yourself without it. A job title that has quietly become your entire sense of who you are, so that a bad quarter at work can feel less like a setback and more like an indictment of your actual worth as a person. A way of being needed by your family that you privately suspect you are not quite ready to release, even as the people around you grow up and need you differently than they used to. An identity built around being the reliable one, the strong one, the one who always handles things, worn for so long that you have nearly forgotten it was ever something you put on rather than something you simply are, something you could, in theory, set down for an evening without the entire structure of your life collapsing. None of these roles are wrong to hold. The king was not wrong to defend his kingdom, and you are not wrong to take your responsibilities seriously. The invitation tonight is simply to notice the difference between holding a role and disappearing into it completely. The difference between wearing a crown and becoming unable to imagine your own face without one. There is a particular kind of fear that lives specifically inside success, quieter than the fear that lives inside failure, but no less real for being quieter. It whispers that if you ever stop gripping this tightly, whatever you have built might simply slip away, and you along with it. That your worth and your achievement have become so fused together that loosening your hold on one necessarily means losing the other. The king's entire life argues against this particular fear. He had every reason to grip his throne as tightly as any ruler in history, every justification a person could ask for. He chose, instead, to discover whether he could set something down voluntarily, while it was still entirely his to keep, rather than waiting for time or circumstance to eventually pry it from his hands, the way it eventually does for everyone, regardless of how tightly they held on. You might ask yourself, gently, tonight, what role you are currently holding so tightly that you have forgotten it is a role at all, rather than the whole of who you are. You do not need an answer before you sleep. You only need to notice that the question is allowed to be asked. The same question a king once asked himself at the exact moment when asking it made the least conventional sense, and answered anyway. Walking away from the very top of the mountain, everyone else spends their lives trying to climb. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice if there is some role, some identity, some hard-won success You have been gripping more tightly than it actually requires. You do not need to release it tonight. You only need to notice that, like everything else we have spoken of this evening, it is allowed to be held a little more loosely than you have been holding it. When you are ready, we will continue together. We have traveled tonight from a steering wheel to a muddy road, from an old friendship to a rainstorm, from a mountain monastery to a king's abandoned throne. Each stop has been a different shape of the same single hand, learning a little more each time what it feels like to open. Next, we will bring all of this back down into the particular, ordinary noise of the life you actually live, the one with traffic and deadlines, and a world that rarely slows down long enough to ask you any of these questions itself. We have moved, tonight, through monasteries and mountains and muddy roads, through stories set in places far from anywhere you are likely to find yourself this week. It is worth asking, honestly, what any of this has to do with your actual Tuesday morning, the one with traffic and a calendar already full before you have finished your coffee, the one where nobody is asking you to defend a kingdom or sit through a thunderstorm in a cremation ground, where the closest thing to a forest is the row of plants someone in your office waters once a week if they remember. The honest answer is that every teaching we have walked through tonight was always meant to come back here, into exactly this kind of ordinary, unglamorous noise, because this is where most of your actual life happens to take place. Almost none of us will ever face a king's decision about a throne, the kind of decision that changes the course of a whole nation. Almost all of us will face, repeatedly, this week alone, smaller versions of the same basic choice. Grip tightly or hold loosely, brace against the noise, or find some way to remain steady inside it. Tonight, we want to clear up something that has likely been sitting quietly in the back of your mind since we began. A worry that non-attachment, taken seriously, might mean caring less about the people and the work and the life you actually have. This worry deserves a direct answer rather than a vague reassurance, because an unanswered worry like this one tends to quietly undermine everything else we have practiced together so far tonight, even if you never quite put it into words. Non-attachment does not mean caring less. It means caring without the second, exhausting layer of needing things to turn out a particular way before you allow yourself to feel at peace. This is the difference between a sanctuary and a wall. A wall keeps the noisy world out entirely, at the cost of keeping you out of the world as well. Unreachable, uninvolved, safely numb, mistaking the absence of feeling for the presence of peace. A trade most people only discover they have made once they notice how little they actually feel anymore, even during the good parts of their lives. A sanctuary is something else entirely. It lets everything in: the traffic, the deadlines, the difficult phone call, the long day, and still offers somewhere steady to stand in the middle of all of it. The way a lighthouse does not keep the storm from happening, only offers a fixed point that does not move regardless of how the water around it behaves. Building this kind of sanctuary has nothing to do with your physical location, your schedule, or how much chaos surrounds you on any given day. It has to do with something considerably more portable than any of that. Most people, when they imagine inner peace, imagine a kind of subtraction. Fewer obligations, fewer demands, fewer people needing something from them at any given moment. A calendar finally empty enough to breathe in. This can sound like the obvious solution, but it means chasing a condition that almost never actually arrives, and that, even when it briefly does arrive, rarely produces the peace it promised. You have likely had the experience of finally getting a quiet weekend, a clear schedule, an empty house, and discovering that your mind kept right on running at the same pace anyway, simply with less external noise to blame it on. Still rehearsing tomorrow's problems in a room that has finally gone completely silent. This suggests something important. The noise outside you and the agitation inside you are not actually the same thing, even though they often arrive together and feel, in the moment, indistinguishable. You can be standing in the middle of genuine chaos, a crying child, a deadline an hour away, 3 people needing 3 different things from you at once, and still locate something steady underneath all of it. The way the river beneath a storm keeps moving in roughly the same direction, regardless of how hard the rain falls on its surface. Or you can be sitting in complete, undisturbed silence and still feel as agitated as you would in the middle of rush hour traffic, because the agitation was never actually coming from outside you in the first place. And removing the outside noise simply removes the convenient excuse for where the feelings seem to be coming from. The sanctuary we are talking about tonight lives in that second location, inside you, available regardless of how loud or quiet your actual circumstances happen to be. This is, frankly, good news, because most of us have very little control over how loud our circumstances get. Children do not consult your nervous system before deciding when to have a difficult day. Deadlines rarely reschedule themselves around your need for calm. Traffic does not part out of consideration for how badly you needed today to go smoothly. If your peace depends entirely on the external volume being turned down, you will spend most of your life waiting for a kind of quiet that may never actually arrive in the form you are hoping for. Non-attachment, again, is the practice that makes this internal sanctuary possible. And again, it is worth repeating because the misunderstanding runs deep. This does not mean caring less about the crying child or the looming deadline. It means holding your care for them without simultaneously demanding that caring guarantee a particular outcome. You can love someone completely and still not be able to control whether their day goes well. You can do excellent work and still not be able to control whether the deadline produces the result you hoped for. The caring and the controlling were never actually the same activity, even though most of us were taught, somewhere along the way, that real caring requires a certain amount of anxious gripping in order to count as sincere. As though love that does not also worry constantly must somehow be love that does not run very deep. Let us explore a story about this. There is a nurse who has worked in the emergency department of a large city hospital for almost a decade now, in a building that never really goes quiet. Fluorescent lights humming the same flat hum at 3 in the afternoon as at 3 in the morning, where the doors open onto a waiting room that fills and empties and fills again in a rhythm that has nothing to do with the clock on the wall. In her first years on the job, she cared the way she had been taught to care, which meant carrying every patient home with her at the end of a shift, replaying the difficult cases on the drive home, lying awake afterward, wondering whether she had missed something, whether a different choice might have changed an outcome she had no actual power to change. She believed, the way many of us believe without examining it closely, that this constant carrying was simply the cost of being a good nurse. Proof that she had not gone numb to the suffering in front of her. She nearly left the profession entirely in her 4th year, exhausted in a way that had stopped responding to sleep or vacation or anything else she tried. The kind of tiredness that sits in the bones rather than the eyes, that a full night's sleep barely touches. A senior colleague, someone who had worked the same kind of shifts for twice as long without seeming to carry the same grey exhaustion. Someone the younger nurses quietly admired without quite understanding how she managed it. Noticed the particular look of someone close to burning out completely, and sat with her one slow night shift in the break room, 2 cups of bad coffee going cold between them. Do you think caring more would have changed what happened to that patient? The colleague asked, naming a difficult case from the week before that the younger nurse was still turning over in her mind at 3 in the morning. The younger nurse said she did not know. The colleague said that was the most honest answer available to anyone, and that the not knowing was exactly the place worth sitting with, rather than trying to resolve it by gripping the case more tightly, hour after hour, as though enough worry might somehow retroactively change the outcome. Over the following months, she began experimenting with something different, not less care, but a different relationship to the care she was already giving. There was, for instance, an elderly man who came in confused and frightened late one night. No family with him yet. The fluorescent light overhead, making everything look slightly too sharp and too pale, gripping her hand tightly enough to leave marks while they waited for his test results. She sat with him the entire time she could spare, answering the same anxious question 3 or 4 times without any impatience showing in her voice, because in that particular hour, he was the only thing that needed her full attention, and giving it to him completely required nothing held back, nothing rationed for later. She would be fully present with each patient this way while she was actually with them, asking questions, listening closely, doing everything within her actual ability to help. And then, at the end of each shift, she practiced something close to what we have been calling setting down, deliberately, almost ritually, in the parking garage before driving home, sitting for a moment in the driver's seat with the engine still off, naming each difficult case from the day out loud or simply in her own mind, acknowledging that she had done what was hers to do, and choosing, as a practice rather than a feeling that arrived automatically, to leave the rest of it at the hospital where it had happened, before turning the key and actually driving home. It did not work perfectly every night. Some cases came home with her anyway, the way ghosts sometimes do, regardless of how clearly you try to recognize them as ghosts. A particular face or a particular voice surfacing at 2 in the morning, despite every effort made in the parking garage hours earlier. She did not treat these failures as evidence that the practice did not work, only as evidence that some weights take longer to set down than others. The same way the woman with the old friendship needed 30 years and several attempts before the habit finally loosened its grip. But over time, the practice became more reliable, and something unexpected happened alongside it. She found she had more genuine warmth available for each new patient, not less, because she was no longer arriving at each shift already depleted by everything she had carried home from the last one. Her care had not gotten smaller. It had simply stopped being mixed together with an exhausting, unnecessary insistence that she personally control outcomes that had never actually been hers to control. Her colleagues sometimes asked, in the years that followed, how she managed to stay so warm after so many years in a department that burns most people out within a handful of them. She never had a tidy answer for this, but she had stopped believing that warmth and exhaustion were required companions. She had simply learned to do the actual work of caring, fully, while she was doing it, and then to let the parking garage be the place where the shift and her relationship to it actually ended for the night. The way a monk once set a woman down on the far side of a muddy road and kept walking, carrying nothing of the crossing with him that did not still belong to the present moment. Years later, training a new nurse fresh out of school who reminded her uncomfortably of herself at that age, all earnestness and no boundaries yet, working doubles without complaint and taking every hard case home in her face, if not in her actual schedule. She found herself repeating something close to what her own colleague had once said to her, sitting in the same break room with the same bad coffee going cold. She did not tell the younger woman to care less. That was never the lesson, and she had learned by then not to lead with it, since it tends to land as permission to become callous rather than permission to stay soft for longer, which is a very different gift to offer someone just starting out. She told her, instead, to notice the exact moment each shift when caring turned into carrying, and to practice, deliberately, setting the difference down before it could harden into the kind of exhaustion that eventually drives so many good, caring people out of the work entirely, often the very ones who can least afford to be lost from it. You do not work in an emergency department, most likely, but you almost certainly have your own version of carrying things home that were never meant to come home with you. Things picked up without ever quite deciding to pick them up. A difficult conversation that keeps replaying through dinner. A worry about someone you love that follows you into a meeting that has nothing to do with them. A general, low-grade tension that has become so constant you have nearly forgotten it has a source at all. The way a hum in a room becomes inaudible after long enough simply because you have stopped noticing it is there. The sanctuary we are building tonight is not a place you go to escape these things. It is a practice of meeting them fully when they are actually present, and then, deliberately, setting them down when their moment has passed, the way the nurse learned to do in a parking garage, the way a monk did on the far side of a road, the way a king did at the height of his own victory. None of them stopped caring. All of them simply stopped confusing caring with carrying. You might try this yourself tonight, in whatever small way fits your own life, however small the version of it happens to be. If there is something from today still riding along with you into sleep, something you cared about completely while it was happening, you can acknowledge that you did what was yours to do, and that the rest of it, the outcome, the worry, the wondering whether you did enough, was never actually within your control to begin with. This is not indifference. This is the opposite of indifference. The full, undiluted version of caring, finally separated from the exhausting performance of anxious control that so often gets mistaken for it. The way the nurse's warmth only grew once she stopped weighing it down, with everything it had never actually needed to carry. The world outside your window will likely stay just as loud tomorrow as it was today. The sanctuary does not require the world to quiet down first. It only requires you to keep practicing the small, repeatable act of caring completely, and then, just as completely, letting go. The same practice, over and over, in a parking garage or a kitchen or a quiet bedroom, or wherever your own version of the day happens to actually end tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice anything you might be carrying home tonight that was never actually meant to come home with you. A conversation, a worry, a small, unresolved thread from somewhere earlier in your day. You do not need to solve it. You only need to notice the difference between having cared and still being needed to care right this moment. The way the nurse learned to notice it in a parking garage, one shift at a time, for years, until the noticing finally became easier and faster than the carrying ever was. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teacher, in a tradition we have not yet visited tonight, who wore the same patched robe for most of his adult life and asked something difficult of anyone who wanted to sit with him. A practice that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with finally letting go of the need to be seen a certain way at all. A different kind of sanctuary entirely, built not from softness, but from a willingness to be stripped of almost everything. Most of us spend our lives quietly accumulating. We will sit with him next. We are going to sit, for a while, with a teacher who made this unusually difficult for anyone who wanted to study under him. If you wanted an audience with him, you were required, first, to perform 3,000 full prostrations, lowering your entire body to the ground, rising, lowering again, 3,000 separate times, before he would agree to see you at all. This can sound, on first hearing, like an exercise in vanity, a teacher demanding excessive deference before granting his attention. It means something close to the opposite. He was not asking this for his own benefit. He had no particular need to watch strangers exhaust themselves on a stone floor. He asked it because he had noticed something true about almost everyone who comes looking for a teacher, that they usually arrive still fully dressed in who they think they are. Their reputation, their accomplishments, their certainty about being right, and that none of this particular clothing tends to survive 3,000 prostrations intact. Tonight's facet of non-attachment is the one most closely tied to the ego, the part of you that needs to be right, needs to be seen a certain way, needs to maintain a particular version of yourself, even when maintaining it costs you considerably more than it is worth. This need rarely announces itself directly. It shows up disguised as principle, as standards, as simply caring about getting things correct. Underneath nearly all of these disguises, though, sits the same quiet demand that the world confirm, again and again, that you are who you believe yourself to be, that your version of events, your competence, your basic goodness, never be seriously questioned by anyone whose opinion you have decided matters. The teacher we are meeting tonight spent most of his adult life systematically removing every comfortable confirmation of identity available to him, one at a time, until almost nothing remained except the bare fact of his own attention. What he discovered in the process was not emptiness, in the way that word sometimes frightens people, a hollow absence where a person used to be. It was considerably more spacious than that, closer to a room with the furniture finally cleared out of it, room enough to actually move. Letting go of the need to be right is, for most of us, one of the harder practices to even recognize we are avoiding, because being right rarely feels like something we are gripping in the moment. It feels like simply seeing clearly, like reporting an accurate fact rather than defending a fragile position. The other person is wrong. The situation calls for this particular response and not another. Your version of events is the accurate one. None of this feels like grasping while you are inside it. It feels like truth, plain and uncomplicated. Nothing to release, because there is nothing there to call a grip. This can sound like an argument for never having opinions, or never standing firmly behind something you actually believe. It means something more specific than that. The grip we are talking about is not the holding of a view. It is the attachment to the view being confirmed by everyone else. The small, persistent need for your rightness to be witnessed and validated before you can relax into the rest of your evening. You can hold a view completely, act on it fully, and still release your grip on whether anyone else agrees with you tonight, or ever. Most of us were never taught this distinction, and so we treat disagreement as a threat to be defended against, rather than simply a fact to be noted and set down again. The way you might note the weather without needing the sky to agree with your preferences about it. Notice how much of an ordinary day gets spent, in one form or another, defending a position, correcting a small inaccuracy that did not actually need correcting, replaying an argument to make sure your side of it still holds up under further examination hours after it actually ended. None of this is necessarily wrong to do. But notice, too, the particular flavor of relief that arrives when you finally stop. When you let a small inaccuracy simply pass uncorrected. When you allow someone else's version of events to stand even though you remember it slightly differently. This relief is the same relief we have been circling all evening. Simply wearing the costume of being wrong, or at least of allowing yourself to be perceived as wrong, rather than the costume of a finished meeting or an old friendship. Control operates the same way, slightly larger in scope. Most of us believe, somewhere underneath conscious thought, that maintaining tight control over circumstances is what keeps things from falling apart. This belief rarely gets examined directly, because examining it would require admitting how much of what we control so carefully was never actually within our power to control in the first place. You can manage a project carefully and still not control whether it succeeds. You can raise a child attentively and still not control who they eventually become. You can plan an evening meticulously and still not control whether it unfolds the way you pictured. You can rehearse a difficult conversation a dozen times in the shower and still not control how the other person actually responds once you are standing in front of them. Control, in nearly every case that matters, is a story we tell ourselves about influence we genuinely have, mixed together with an exhausting illusion of certainty we never actually had to begin with. The teacher tonight built an entire practice around stripping this illusion away as directly as possible, starting with the most basic and most stubborn form of it, the conviction that you deserve to be received, recognized, and respected exactly as you currently see yourself. Let us explore a story about this. There was a boy in Korea, born into a family of scholars, who could read by the age of 3 and had worked through entire volumes of classical literature by the time he was 10, devouring long historical tales meant for adults twice his age, the kind of child grown-ups already suspected was destined for something unusual, though nobody yet knew what. As a young man, he read widely and seriously. Philosophy and religion, from both his own culture and others entirely foreign to it, filling notebook after notebook with questions that none of the available answers seemed to satisfy, no matter how far afield he searched for them. He was, by his own later account, deeply and genuinely dissatisfied, convinced that none of what he had read so far could actually lead him to the truth he was looking for. However many books he worked his way through in pursuit of it, everything shifted when an older monk handed him a short, old text on enlightenment, written centuries earlier by a Chinese teacher. the pages worn soft at the edges from having passed through many hands before reaching his. Reading it, he later said, he felt like a bright light suddenly switched on inside a room that had been completely dark for as long as he could remember being in it. He began meditating intensively, almost immediately, focusing his entire attention on a single difficult question used in his tradition to short-circuit ordinary thinking, setting aside virtually everything else in his life to pursue it, including, before long, his own family's expectations about what a young man of his background was supposed to be doing with his days. He had, at this point, no particular interest in becoming an ordained monk at all. He wanted only to meditate, convinced that the robes and the formal vows were beside the point, an unnecessary layer of ceremony between him and the actual work he wanted to do. It took a respected senior teacher, delivering a talk about how no one can hand you the answer you are looking for, how you alone have to find your own way through a door that, once you have actually passed through it, turns out never to have been a door in the first place, to finally change his mind. He took his vow shortly afterward and threw himself completely into practice, with an intensity that quickly became the subject of quiet astonishment among the other monks around him, sitting through entire nights when others had long since gone to rest, walking from one remote mountain temple to the next in search of teachers rumored to have gone further than anyone else currently living. In time, after years of this relentless practice, sleeping little, eating sparingly, sitting through entire seasons in unheated rooms, he experienced what his tradition calls a major awakening, a shift in understanding that he later described in his own poem using the image of a great river suddenly reversing its course, flowing backward toward its own source, the sun and moon momentarily losing their usual light, the solid ground itself seeming to fall away beneath him, before settling, in the closing lines, into something calm and unchanged, a quiet mountain standing exactly where it had always stood, simply seen clearly for the first time in his life. What followed, over the coming decades, was one of the most demanding monastic lives Korean Buddhism had seen in generations. He wore a single grey robe, patched and mended so many times that barely any of the original cloth remained, the fabric gone thin and soft as paper in places, for what amounted to half his adult life, refusing on principle to replace it with anything newer, even as wealthy admirers occasionally offered. He mended his own torn clothing and worn socks by hand rather than asking for new ones, sitting in lamplight with needle and thread the way his own mother might once have, and used scrap paper rather than anything purchased new, treating even the smallest material comfort as something worth questioning before accepting it automatically. For a period of roughly 8 years following his deepest meditative breakthrough, he did not lie down to sleep at all, maintaining an upright meditation posture through what would ordinarily have been his resting hours, night after night, for years on end, his body apparently adjusting, over time, to a kind of rest that did not require lying flat at all. When he eventually became one of the most respected teachers in the country, sought out by serious students from across Korea, some traveling considerable distances on the strength of his reputation alone, he made meeting him deliberately difficult. Anyone who wanted an audience with him was required first to perform 3,000 full prostrations, lowering their entire body flat to the ground and rising again, 3,000 separate times, their knees and palms growing raw against the stone floor long before the count was anywhere near finished, before he would agree to receive them. He was explicit that this was never meant as a hardship imposed for his own benefit. It was meant to strip away, through sheer physical exhaustion, whatever sense of status, importance, or certainty a visitor had carried in through the door with them. The carefully maintained posture of someone important enough to deserve immediate access, so that whatever conversation followed could happen between two people rather than between a supplicant and someone they had already decided, before arriving, was simply right about everything. He was not, by most accounts, an easy or comfortable man to be close to, and he made no particular effort to soften that reputation during his own lifetime. He had, early in his monastic life, refused even to see his own mother when she traveled some distance to visit him, sending word through another monk that there was no need for the meeting, a response that scandalized some of the other monks around him as needlessly harsh. The kind of severity that seemed to go beyond discipline into something closer to coldness. And yet, when he did eventually relent and meet her, he did not simply offer a brief, formal greeting and send her on her way. He spent the time walking her personally around the sacred sites of the mountain where he lived, pointing out views and old shrines, an unhurried kindness that suggests something more complicated than simple coldness was actually at work in him all along. He had spent years stripping away the need to be seen a particular way, including, it seems, the need to be seen as endlessly available or conventionally warm on demand. What was left, once that particular need had been worn down, was something he could offer freely, on his own terms, rather than out of obligation or performance, which is perhaps why those who did spend real time with him so often described him, despite the famous severity, as one of the most genuinely free people they had ever met. You are very unlikely to require 3,000 prostrations from anyone tonight, and you are not being asked to start. But you might ask yourself, gently, what you would need to strip away before you could meet someone, or a situation, without your usual need to be right, to be seen a certain way, to maintain the particular version of yourself you have spent years carefully constructing and quietly defending. The way every other weight we have spoken of this evening eventually revealed itself to be optional, once it was finally looked at directly, instead of simply endured without question. This need shows up in smaller, more ordinary moments than a monastery doorway. It shows up in the urge to correct someone over something that does not actually matter. A date, a small detail in a story, a fact that changes nothing about the conversation except who gets to be accurate in it. It shows up in the particular tightness that arrives when you are told you made a mistake. A tightness that is rarely about the mistake itself and almost always about what the mistake threatens to say about who you are. It shows up in how difficult it can be to simply say you do not know, when not knowing feels, for reasons that rarely survive close examination, like a kind of failure rather than simply an honest report of your actual current understanding. Letting go of this particular grip does not mean abandoning your standards or your judgment. The teacher in tonight's story held extraordinarily high standards, for himself most of all, perhaps the highest standards of anyone in his entire tradition during his lifetime. What he released was something more specific, the need for those standards to be witnessed, validated, and agreed with by everyone around him before he could feel settled in himself. He could be wrong, occasionally, and remain entirely himself. He could be misunderstood, frequently, and often was, and remain entirely himself regardless. The self in question had stopped depending on anyone else's verdict about it. You might notice, lying here tonight, some small version of this grip still active in you. Some recent moment where being right mattered more than it probably needed to. Some old disagreement you are still quietly relitigating because some part of you has not yet been declared the winner of it. Perhaps it was a conversation with a sibling, a co-worker, a partner, where the actual content of the disagreement has long since stopped mattering, and what remains is simply the unfinished business of needing the last word. You do not need 3,000 prostrations to begin loosening this particular grip. You only need to notice it, the way we have been noticing everything else tonight, and ask yourself whether being right, in this specific case, is actually worth what it is currently costing you to keep defending it, hour after hour, long after anyone else involved has likely stopped thinking about it at all. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice if any part of you is currently bracing to defend a position, a version of events, a sense of being right about something, even something small. You do not need to release it. Simply notice that it is there, the way a teacher once asked strangers to notice their own exhaustion before he would speak with them at all. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is one more figure we will meet tonight. A man who once stood at the edge of a deep mountain lake holding a burning lamp, and made a wager with his own life that asked for something even larger than letting go of being right. He asked himself whether he could let go of needing to survive the answer at all. A question considerably more final than any disagreement you or I are likely to find ourselves defending tonight. We will stand at the edge of that water with him next. We come now to the last new teacher we will meet tonight, and to the deepest version of letting go we will ask of you this evening. Everything so far has asked you to release something you are already holding, a finished meeting, an old friendship, a successful reign, a need to be right. Tonight's figure asks something stranger. He asks whether you can let go of needing to know, in advance, whether you will survive what comes next at all. This sounds, stated plainly like that, almost too large to be useful to you. Lying here in a warm bed, with nothing actually at stake tonight beyond a good night's sleep. It is worth sitting with anyway, because the shape of what he did contains, in an extreme and dramatic form, something every one of us does in miniature, almost daily, usually without noticing it. We constantly ask reality to confirm us before we are willing to commit to anything. We want to know the outcome will be good before we are willing to try. We want certainty about whether we are right, whether we are loved, whether the leap will land safely, before we are willing to actually leap. Tonight's teacher, a Bhutanese treasure revealer working centuries ago in the high valleys of the Himalayas, was accused, during his own lifetime, of being a complete fraud. The specific accusation does not matter as much as what he chose to do about it. Rather than defending himself with words, rather than gathering evidence or arguing his case in front of doubters, he made a public wager with his own life, one that offered no possibility of a safe middle outcome. He would either be proven genuine, or he would die in the attempt, in front of everyone watching, with no room left over for any gentler third option. This is non-attachment carried to its furthest visible edge, the complete release of the need to control how an uncertain situation resolves. including the most basic outcome of all, whether you yourself remain alive at the end of it. Few of us will ever be asked to demonstrate non-attachment this directly, and we are not suggesting you should go looking for an equivalent test in your own life. But the underlying practice, the willingness to act fully and release your grip on guaranteeing the result, is the same practice we have been circling all night, simply turned up, for one particular evening centuries ago, to its absolute maximum volume. Most of what keeps us from fully committing to anything important in our lives is not actually a lack of desire or a lack of ability. It is a lack of certainty about the outcome, combined with an unwillingness to act until that certainty arrives. We wait to start the business until we are sure it will succeed. We wait to say the difficult thing until we are sure it will be received well. We wait to fully love someone until we are sure they will not eventually leave. We wait to apply for the role we actually want until we are sure we will get it, which is, of course, a guarantee that no application has ever come with. This waiting can sound like simple prudence, careful planning rather than impulsive risk. It means something considerably more limiting than that. It means postponing your actual life indefinitely in exchange for a guarantee that was never available to you in the first place, and was never going to become available no matter how long you waited for it. Total surrender. The facet we are exploring in this final new teaching tonight is the practice of acting completely, with your whole attention and your whole effort, while releasing your grip on needing the outcome to be confirmed in advance. This is different from recklessness. Recklessness acts without care for consequences. Total surrender acts with complete care, complete preparation, complete seriousness about what is at stake. And then, having done everything within its actual power, lets go of the part that was never within its power to begin with, which is the final result itself. You have likely felt a small version of this difference yourself, in moments that mattered considerably less than the one tonight's teacher faced. The moment right before you press send on a message you have agonized over. The moment right before you walk into an interview, or a difficult conversation, or a stage, when all the preparation is finished and there is genuinely nothing left to do except discover what happens next. Most of us spend this particular moment bracing, as though bracing might somehow influence the outcome still to come. It rarely does. What it reliably does is exhaust you slightly more than the actual situation already required. There is a particular kind of peace available, specifically in the moment after preparation has ended and before the outcome has arrived. A narrow window most of us rush straight through without noticing, eager to escape the uncertainty by reaching the result as quickly as possible, checking the message the instant it might have been read, refreshing the page before there has been any realistic time for it to change. Tonight's teacher seems to have done something unusual with that exact window. Rather than rushing through it, he appears to have stepped directly into the middle of it and stayed there, fully, without flinching away from how completely unresolved everything still was, for as long as the water kept him beneath its surface. This connects back, in a way, to everything we have practiced tonight without quite naming it this directly. The fist closes whenever we cannot tolerate an unresolved present moment, whenever we need the meeting to have gone differently, the friendship to have ended better, the rain to have not fallen, the throne to have remained ours, the disagreement to have been settled in our favor, the prostrations to have been unnecessary. Tonight asks the largest version of this same question. and you remain inside an unresolved moment, even the most serious one imaginable, without your hand closing around a desperate need for it to resolve in your favor. Let us explore a story about this. He was born in a high mountain valley in what is now Bhutan, the son of a respected lama from an old religious lineage, though his own early life gave little outward sign of the path he would eventually walk. At 9 years old, he was sent to apprentice with his grandfather, a blacksmith, learning to work the bellows and the forge in a small, smoky workshop that smelled permanently of charcoal and hot iron. He proved unusually skilled at the trade, hammering out millstones, iron cooking pans, chainmail, swords, and knives with a precision that impressed everyone who watched him work. His hands steady at an age when most boys could barely hold the tongs correctly. Even as a boy, though, he would sometimes set his tools aside between commissions and sit on an overturned crate as though it were a throne, pretending to give religious teachings and blessings to an audience that existed only in his own imagination. A small detail that nobody around him thought much of at the time. Simply a child's game played out in the quiet hours of an ordinary working day. He continued largely as a blacksmith into adulthood, his religious inclinations present but unfulfilled, until a series of strange dreams began arriving in his mid-20s. Dreams he did not know how to interpret, and initially dismissed as nothing more than an overworked mind, producing strange images in the dark. 2 years after the first of these dreams, while resting near a small monastery on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, he was woken by a voice telling him to get up. A monk in ragged, worn robes stood nearby, holding out a small scroll, and told him only to look closely at it before disappearing entirely, as though he had never been there at all. No footsteps retreating, no door closing, simply gone. Unrolling the scroll, the young blacksmith found instructions, written in a script he somehow found he could suddenly read despite never having studied it, directing him to gather 5 friends and travel, on the night of the coming full moon, to a particular cliff above a small lake known locally as Naring Drak, where his own destiny was said to be waiting for him underneath a rock. His father dismissed the whole thing as nonsense. His mother was less certain, recalling that a famous treasure revealer from an earlier generation had received a strikingly similar instruction before going on to reveal genuine sacred texts hidden in the landscape by ancient masters centuries earlier. On the appointed night, the young man persuaded 5 reluctant friends to accompany him to the cliff above the lake. When he arrived at the edge of the water, something came over him that he could not fully explain afterward. Without speaking, without any apparent hesitation, he stripped off his clothes and dove directly into the dark water below. What he found beneath the surface defied easy explanation, even by his own later account. A hidden cave containing ancient texts and sacred objects arranged as though waiting specifically for him, guarded by a presence that handed him a coded scroll before he found himself. Moments later, propelled back up to the surface as though carried by an unseen current, breaking into open air again with no clear memory of how he had traveled from the depths back to the light. He emerged holding a text that, once decoded over the following days, proved to be a genuine and previously unknown sacred teaching, the kind of discovery that should, by any ordinary measure, have taken a team of scholars years to locate, rather than a single untrained blacksmith a few minutes underwater. Word spread quickly through the valley, and with it, Inevitably came skepticism. He was, after all, a local blacksmith with no formal religious training, claiming to retrieve hidden teachings that scholars far more credentialed than him had spent entire careers searching for without success. The local governor of the district decided to settle the matter publicly rather than let the rumors continue unresolved, summoning the young man to answer for himself in front of the entire community. He gathered a large crowd at the same cliff above the same lake, villagers and skeptics and curious onlookers pressing close along the edge of the water to see what would happen, and issued a direct challenge. If the young man could retrieve another treasure from the water in front of everyone, the governor would publicly support him from that day forward. If he failed, he would be punished for the disruption his claims had caused throughout the district. A punishment left deliberately vague but clearly understood by everyone present to be severe. Whether this was framed as a contest with his life directly on the line, or simply as a public test of his credibility, the stakes for a young man with no protection beyond his own conviction were considerable either way, and the murmuring crowd around him made no secret of which outcome most of them were expecting. He did not hesitate, and he did not attempt to negotiate softer terms. He took a lit butter lamp in one hand, declared in front of the entire assembled crowd that if he was genuine, he would return from the water with both a sacred treasure and the lamp still burning, and that if he was a fraud, he was willing to die in the lake rather than continue deceiving anyone. And then, without waiting for any further response from the crowd, he jumped. The water closed over him, lamp and all. For a long moment, by every account that survives, nobody watching had any idea what they were about to see. Then he broke the surface, holding a sealed box made of joined skulls in one hand. And, somehow, against every reasonable expectation of how fire and water interact, the small butter lamp in his other hand, still burning. He never spoke afterward, in anything that survives, about having calculated his odds of survival before making that particular declaration. What he seemed to understand, in the moment he stripped off his clothes the first time and dove into water that might easily have killed him, was that there had never actually been a safer option available to him. He could perform the test and risk death, or he could spend the remainder of his life as a blacksmith, quietly known throughout his valley as either a liar or a madman, neither outcome offering any real safety to retreat into. Once he saw clearly that safety in the ordinary sense was simply not on the table, the choice in front of him stopped being a choice between risk and security, and became, instead, a choice between two different ways of being fully alive, one of which happened to be considerably more honest than the other. He chose honesty, fully, with no portion of himself held back in reserve in case the water did not cooperate. The lake where this happened is still visited by pilgrims today, known now as the Burning Lake, named for the small flame that should never have survived what it survived that afternoon. He went on, over the following decades, to reveal dozens more hidden treasures across the region, to be respected eventually by every major school of practice in his tradition rather than dismissed by them, and to found a lineage of teachers that, by some accounts, continues in an unbroken line to the present day. None of this came from the moment at the lake alone, but the moment at the lake appears to have been the place where he stopped negotiating with his own fear long enough to discover what was actually possible once he did. You are extremely unlikely to be asked, tonight or ever, to jump into a lake holding a burning lamp with your life as the wager. But you have very likely been asked, more times than you have probably counted, to commit fully to something without any guarantee of how it will turn out. And you have very likely, more times than you would like to admit, waited for a guarantee that was never going to arrive before allowing yourself to commit at all. This shows up in the relationship you have been holding at arm's length, fully present in some ways and quietly braced in others, waiting for proof that loving completely will not eventually leave you devastated. It shows up in the work you keep almost starting, waiting for a sign that the effort will definitely pay off before you are willing to invest yourself in it completely. It shows up in the apology you have been rehearsing for weeks without actually delivering it, waiting for a guarantee that it will be received well before you are willing to risk it being received badly instead. It shows up, perhaps most quietly of all, in the way many of us approach sleep itself, holding some small part of ourselves back from fully letting go, as though staying slightly vigilant might somehow protect us from whatever the night or the morning has in store, when in fact it only protects us from the actual rest we came here tonight to receive. Total surrender does not require you to take reckless risks with no preparation behind them. The teacher in tonight's story did not act carelessly. He prepared as fully as a person in his position could prepare, then acted completely, then released his grip on the part that was never his to control to begin with. This is the same shape every facet of non-attachment we have explored tonight has eventually revealed. Do everything that is actually yours to do, fully, and then set down the part that belongs to outcomes you were never going to be able to guarantee no matter how tightly you held on. You might ask yourself, gently, tonight, what you are currently holding back from fully because you have not yet received the guarantee you are waiting for. You do not need an answer before you sleep. You only need to notice that the guarantee you are waiting for may simply never arrive in the form you are hoping for, the way it never arrived for the man at the edge of the lake. No reassurance offered in advance, no promise of a safe outcome whispered to him before he jumped, and that you are still, despite this, allowed to commit fully to your own life, regardless, the way he did, with no portion of yourself held back in case it does not work out exactly as you hoped. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice anywhere in your life right now where you are waiting for a guarantee before allowing yourself to fully commit, fully rest, fully arrive in this exact moment. Fully close your eyes without holding some small part of yourself in reserve just in case. You do not need the guarantee to arrive tonight. You only need to notice that you have been waiting for one, the way a man once noticed, at the edge of a lake, that no guarantee was ever actually coming, and chose to act fully anyway. When you are ready, we will continue together. We have now walked through every doorway we set out to walk through tonight. The fist in the car, the muddy road, the rainstorm, the throne, the parking garage, the patched robe, the burning lamp at the edge of the water. There is nothing new left to add, and nothing further that needs explaining. What remains, for these final few minutes together, is simply to gather what we have already gathered, slowly, without hurry, and let it settle all the way down into rest. We have walked a long way together tonight, through stories from rivers and forests and palaces and parking garages and the inside of a hand, learning, slowly, to open. There is nothing new left to teach you. What remains, for these final minutes, is simply to walk back through what we have already walked through once. More slowly this time, the way you might walk back through a house at the end of a long day, touching each doorway again, not to learn anything new about it, but simply to remember that you have already been there, and that you are allowed, now, to rest in having arrived. You do not need to remember any of this perfectly. You do not need to hold on to a single word we say in these closing minutes. And you do not need to follow along closely if your attention has already started drifting somewhere softer than careful listening. The teaching has already done whatever it was going to do tonight, in whichever moment it actually landed for you. An hour ago, or 10 minutes ago, or possibly not yet at all. And that is entirely fine too. What follows now is not instruction. It is simply a slow return, a gathering of everything we have already set down together, gently placed back into view one final time before we let it all settle completely. The way you might walk once more through rooms you have already lived in, simply to feel one last time tonight how familiar they have become, how little effort it now takes to find your way through any of them in the dark. Let your body sink a little further into wherever it is resting. There is nothing left to figure out tonight, and there never really was. Underneath all the stories, there was only ever this: a hand, learning slowly, story by story, that it has been allowed to open the entire time. We began this evening with a hand. You may remember it, somewhere in the back of your awareness. A hand closed around a meeting that had already ended hours earlier. A steering wheel gripped tighter than the road actually required. Knuckles pale over something that had already finished happening in every way, except inside one particular mind that had not yet agreed to let it finish. We called this a fist. The particular tightness that arrives whenever some part of us refuses to let an event finish simply because it has already happened. We are not asking you to remember the man in the car, or the details of his evening, or his daughter's drawing, or any of the specifics at all. We are only asking you to notice, one more time, gently, whether your own hand, right now, in this exact moment, is closed around anything that has already happened, anything that finished today, or yesterday, or considerably longer ago than that, anything your body might still be holding simply out of habit rather than necessity. A little further along, we walked beside two travelers on a muddy road, one of whom set something down the moment its purpose was finished, and one of whom carried it for the rest of the day without ever quite deciding to. "Are you still carrying her?" one of them asked the other, and the question was never really about the woman on the road at all. It was about how easily we mistake an old judgment, an old grudge, an old version of someone else's mistake, for something still requiring our attention long after it stopped actually needing it. How easily a single afternoon can stretch itself across an entire evening simply because one mind decided, without quite deciding, to keep carrying what the road itself had already finished with hours earlier. And further still, we sat with something stranger than either of these, a weight with nothing left holding it up except memory itself, an old argument or an old shame that finished happening decades ago and yet still arrives, uninvited, dressed up as something urgent, a flush of feeling that has nothing left underneath it except the simple fact of being remembered again. We called these ghosts, not because they are not real, but because they visit rather than reside. passing through rather than living permanently in the room with you, regardless of how convincingly they sometimes pretend otherwise, regardless of how many decades they have already had to settle in and make themselves comfortable. All three of these were the same teaching, simply wearing different clothing. A meeting, a road, an old wound, three different sizes of the same exact shape. Something happens, something ends, and the hand, more often than not, keeps holding on long after the holding has stopped serving any purpose at all, simply because nobody ever told it, clearly enough, that it was allowed to do anything else. Let that settle for a moment before we continue. There is no hurry in any of this. We traveled, after that, into a storm, sitting briefly with a teacher who discovered, soaked through and shivering in a cremation ground, that the rain itself was never the real source of his suffering. The resistance was the bracing, the wishing it were different, the second layer of weight stacked on top of something that was simply weather, simply happening, regardless of how he felt about it or how loudly some part of him insisted it should be otherwise. You may have your own storm tonight, something you cannot change, no matter how tightly you hold on. A diagnosis, a loss, a disappointment that has already settled into being exactly what it is. And the invitation remains the same, one he discovered that night. Alone, cold, with nowhere else to go. You are allowed to feel it completely. You are not required to fight it as well. And then we climbed a mountain alongside a king who had already won everything worth winning, who held real victory in his hands. Security, succession, a kingdom finally at peace after years of war, and who chose, at the exact height of all of it, to set it down anyway and walk towards something he had been pulled towards since he was a boy slipping out of a palace at night. This was the hardest letting go of the whole evening, not releasing something painful, but releasing something that, by every visible measure, was working perfectly well. He did not regret what he had built. He simply stopped needing to keep building it forever, stopped needing the throne to remain his in order to remain himself. Between the reign and the throne sits the same single teaching we have circled all night from two different directions. Some things you cannot control, and the practice is to stop fighting them. Some things you can control completely, and the practice is to notice when even your successes have quietly become something you are gripping rather than simply living inside of. Something you are defending rather than simply enjoying. Breathe with that for a moment too, if you are still awake enough to notice yourself breathing at all. We came back down from the mountain into ordinary noise after that, into a hospital that never goes quiet, where a woman learned, slowly and imperfectly, that caring completely and carrying forever were never actually the same practice. However much they had once felt that way, however much she had once believed, exhaustion was simply the price of being good at what she did. Her sanctuary was never a place. It was a parking garage, a few minutes, a deliberate setting down at the end of each long shift, repeated so many times that it eventually became as automatic as the carrying once was. A small private ritual nobody else ever saw her perform. We sat, after that, with a teacher who wore one patched robe for half a lifetime and asked strangers to exhaust themselves at his door before he would speak with them. Not out of cruelty, but because he understood how much of what we call ourselves is simply armor we have never been asked to set down. Status and certainty and the need to be seen a particular way. all of it worn so long we mistake it for skin rather than clothing. And we stood, finally, at the edge of a mountain lake with a man holding a burning lamp, who discovered that the only way through certain doorways is to walk through them without any guarantee at all about what waits on the other side. Surviving or not, believed or not, simply committing completely and releasing the part that was never his to control to begin with. A hospital parking garage, a doorway demanding 3,000 prostrations, the edge of a burning lake. 3 more shapes of the exact same single hand we began this evening with, each one slightly more difficult than the last, each one asking the same quiet question underneath all the different costumes. Can you do what is actually yours to do, fully, and then release your grip on everything that was never yours to control in the first place? The outcome, the recognition, even in the most extreme version we heard tonight, your own survival of the moment. 8 different doorways tonight, 8 different rooms in the same house, and only ever one single hand walking through all of them. This is what non-attachment has actually meant. All evening, underneath every story we have told you. Not coldness, not indifference, not the absence of caring, or trying, or loving, or building something worth building. Simply the slow, repeatable practice of doing what is yours to do, completely, and then opening your hand around the part that belongs to outcomes, to other people's choices, to weather, to time, to whatever happens after you have already given everything you actually have to give. You have likely noticed, somewhere across this evening, your own version of every single one of these. A meeting you are still finishing in your head. An old argument that visits more often than it should. A success you have been gripping a little too tightly, afraid of who you would be without it. A storm in your own life you have been fighting instead of simply feeling. A piece of yourself you have been performing rather than actually being. Something you have been waiting to feel certain about before you would finally let yourself commit to it completely. Perhaps several of these arrived at once while you were listening. Perhaps only one did, quietly, somewhere you did not expect it. None of these need to be solved tonight. That was never the invitation. The invitation, all evening, has simply been to notice, gently, without judgment, the exact shape of your own particular fist, and to discover, the way every figure we met tonight eventually discovered in their own way, that the hand is always allowed to open, a little more, whenever it is ready. Not because anyone is demanding it of you, and not on any particular schedule, because it was never actually serving you to keep it closed this tightly in the first place. And some part of you, underneath everything else, has probably known this for a very long time, long before tonight, long before any of these particular stories gave it a shape and a name worth speaking out loud. The river kept moving the entire time the monk gripped that wheel. The rain kept falling the entire time the young monk braced against it in the dark. The throne would have continued existing whether the king had set it down or not. The lake stayed exactly as deep and as cold the entire time. The blacksmith hesitated at its edge. Nothing in the world outside you has ever actually needed your fist to stay closed in order to keep functioning. It has only ever been waiting. Patiently, the way water waits, the way mountains wait, the way an entire evening of stories has been waiting, for you to notice that your hand was free to open the entire time, and that opening it costs you nothing, the world was ever actually charging you for in the first place. There is a kind of tiredness by this hour of the night that has nothing left to prove and nowhere left to be. If you are feeling it now, that particular heaviness behind the eyes, the sense of a long day finally allowed to actually end, that is exactly where tonight has been leading the whole time. Every story simply another small invitation toward this same softening, repeated in different costumes until something in you finally believed it was safe to arrive here. Safe enough to stop checking the door. Safe enough to let the evening actually be over. Let us rest here now, together, for these final few minutes. Take a slow breath in, and let it go even more slowly than it arrived. Notice your hands, wherever they happen to be resting, and let them be exactly as open or as closed as they actually are right now, with no need to arrange them into anything in particular. No test to pass. No correct way for a hand to be resting at the end of a long evening. Notice your shoulders. Let them drop, just slightly, the way they have been dropping all evening, a small amount at a time, never all at once, never forced, never demanded of you on any particular timeline. Notice your jaw and let it soften. Notice your forehead and let whatever small lines have gathered there over the course of the day simply smooth themselves out on their own, the way water smooths sand without ever seeming to try, without any visible effort at all. Notice whatever is still being held somewhere in your chest, some small unfinished thread from today or from years ago, and simply let it know that it does not need to finish itself tonight. It is allowed to rest here beside you, unresolved, while you rest completely regardless. The two of you sharing the same bed without needing to settle anything between you before morning. You do not need to stay awake for any of this, and nobody is checking. If you have already drifted somewhere between waking and sleep while we have been speaking, that is exactly where you are meant to be right now. The body continues releasing what it needs to release, whether you are listening consciously or not. The hand continues opening, whether you are awake to notice it happening or not. None of this requires your effort or your attention. It only requires your permission, given once, and then simply allowed to continue on its own, quietly, in the background, the way a river continues long after you have stopped watching it, the way a forest keeps breathing long after the last visitor has gone home for the night. Rest is welcome here. Whatever you have heard tonight, let it settle into you slowly, without needing to be remembered, without needing to be used for anything at all beyond exactly what it already is. A few hours of stories, a few invitations to notice your own hand, offered freely, with nothing required of you in return except whatever rest you are able to receive tonight. However much or however little that turns out to be, there is nothing more to add tonight, and nowhere further to go. Everything we set out to explore has been explored. Everything we set out to set down has, at least for this moment, been set down. The man in the car has long since arrived home, his daughter long asleep by now. The two travelers reached their lodging hours ago and went their separate ways the next morning, as travelers eventually do. The rain eventually stopped falling on the teacher in the cremation ground, the way all rain eventually does, no matter how long it feels like it will last while you are sitting inside it. The king lived out his remaining years on the mountain he had always been pulled toward. The nurse drove home from her shift, and the lamp at the edge of the lake, somehow, kept burning the whole way back up to the surface. What remains now is only this: the quiet after a long evening of slowly opening one hand, breath by breath, story by story, for as long as it takes you to finish drifting all the way into sleep. There is no test at the end of this, and there never was. There is no question waiting for you in the morning about what you remember. There is only the rest itself, available now, exactly as it is, for exactly as long as you need it tonight. We have spent this night moving slowly through rivers and rainstorms and a king's quiet mountain, through a parking garage and a patched grey robe and the surface of a burning lake, each story circling the same single question: what are you still holding that you were always allowed to set down? Tonight, story by story, you practiced the smallest possible answer. You noticed. You softened. You opened. A little. One finger at a time. Non-attachment was never about caring less, or feeling less, or becoming someone harder to reach. It was always about this single, repeatable practice, doing fully what is actually yours to do, and then releasing your grip on the part that never belonged to you in the first place. The outcome, the other person's choice, the weather, the verdict, the ending. The hand that closes around a finished moment is not broken. It is simply still waiting for permission. Tonight, in story after story, that permission was given, quietly, again and again, until something in you, hopefully, finally believed it. You do not need to carry any of this forward as a lesson to apply tomorrow. Let it simply settle into you tonight, the way water settles into soil after a long rain, unnoticed, unremembered in any specific detail, and yet somehow still there, quietly changing the shape of the ground underneath you. Before we close, one more honest thing. There is an old voicemail, saved on a phone, 2 devices old by now, that I have never once deleted and never once played through again. I do not fully know why. Tomorrow, when your hand finds itself closing around something the way it always does, may you remember, even briefly, that it is allowed to open again, the same way it opened tonight, story by story, breath by breath, with nothing required of you except the noticing itself. If this hour gave you even a little rest, you are welcome to let us know in the comments, or simply to return tomorrow night for the next one. Either way, you are welcome here. May you sleep deeply tonight, with your hand resting open rather than closed. May whatever you are still carrying grow lighter by morning, not because it disappeared, but because you finally allowed yourself to set part of it down. May you wake rested, and may you wake free. Rest well. We will be here whenever you need to set something down again.